And everybody, welcome to today's Transport Committee meeting. Could we ask David if we've received any apologies for absence this morning?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member McCartney, for whom Assembly Member Desai is substituting, as well as apologies from Assembly Member Prince, for whom Assembly Member Devonish is present.
Welcome. Just to welcome our guests this morning, our main discussion will focus on the London TravelWatch business plan, and we'll also be looking at accessible and inclusive travel across London. To all colleagues on the committee and any audience and the guests, please do turn off your phones to silent so we don't have any vibrating or noises. And to people watching via webcam or online, our hashtag is London Assembly, hashtag Assembly Transport. Are there any declarations of interest apart from the ones noted in the order paper? No. So can we note the declaration? Agreed. Can we confirm the minutes of the last meeting held on the 11th of September 2019?
Yes, agreed.
Agreed? Agreed. Fantastic. And can we note the list of summary actions outlined on page 53 to 62?
Agreed.
Agreed? Yeah. Great, thank you. Just to welcome our first guest for this session, we have Arthur Leathy, who's the chair of London TravelWatch. We have Joanna Simons, who's the interim chief exec, and we have Anthony Smith, who's the chief exec of Transport Focus. Colleagues may be aware that over a year ago, we as the Transport Committee formally rejected the London TravelWatch business plan because we had a number of concerns and we felt that the content wasn't to the standard which we would expect. There's been a number of changes in the TravelWatch organisation. Joanna's come in as an interim exec, and we have a much stronger, much robust business plan looking at the strong direction of travel for the organisation with clearer outputs. And this morning we've been asked to approve an increase of a budget bid of 98,000 just to help TravelWatch with some urgent budgetary costs. Just wanted to get just a quick update from Joanne and Arthur in terms of the business plan, and then we have just some short questions from the committee.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. As you say, it has been a year of considerable change, and we've had close working relationships with yourselves during the year. You've seen the result of a lot of work, particularly by Joanna and her team in preparing the business plan. I think I just really wanted to say that we at London TravelWatch now are very much focused on a closer working relationship with yourselves, and I think that's already showing through in terms of work with officers, and that will continue, and I hope we can improve that relationship. But there's also been a change in the views of the board itself. We've had 3 new members of the board who've come in with very much a consumer-focused interest, and that's showing through, I think, in this business plan in terms of the rigour with which it's been discussed. And I think there's been some real change in the way that we're focusing much more on the user rather than the industry itself. So, and I'm sure there'll be opportunity to discuss that a bit further. But there have been achievements during the year, despite a lot of change. I'm sure Joanna can talk through that if you have the opportunity and time for that. Going forward, we do want to do a lot more campaigning, again focused on the user, looking at bus use, accessibility, and indeed some of the unfairness that's within the rail industry in terms of fares, penalty fares, etc. So there's a lot of work, and some of this is contained in the business plan today. So it was really just an opportunity to introduce Anthony Smith as Chief Executive of Transport Focus. We are going to do a lot of work with Transport Focus going forward, and that's going to give us, I think, a much richer opportunity to really represent the user in terms of research, evidence, and then actually achieving benefits for users around London.
Great.
Okay, if I could just carry on a little bit, thank you very much, Arthur. If I could just firstly start by thanking everybody at the Assembly. Assembly members have been very helpful in actually bearing in mind the history, sharing with us your concerns and hopefully reflected some of that direction of travel in the report. I'd also very much like to place on record my thanks to Ed Williams and his team, obviously Davina and Grace are here, and David, and all the other staff and your own support staff. We found it incredibly useful to get some steers back from them, and I hope you're beginning to see that connection, because overall, above everything else, we want to be useful to the Assembly. And I think we do recognise that hasn't been the case previously. But I hope that whoever's sitting here this time next year, you will feel that we've been both useful and that we've actually been very helpful and got things done for transport users as a specialist resource for you as a Transport Committee. Moving forward, in terms of the business plan, what we've tried to do this year is to take a different approach. I think it's completely fair to say that, I almost hate to say this, that previously we've kind of got a bit too much into waffle. We've not been clear enough about outcomes. What we've tried to do is to be more honest about telling our story. We are a small organisation, but I think we've got a strong history in terms of the evidence-based research that's been carried out over the last few years. We may have lost a bit of direction previously, but there's a lot of good work there for the future. And I think in this plan, what we try to do is to show you a little bit about the day-to-day work that's ongoing, that carries on year in year. And every year we make some progress. And I think last year we're particularly proud of a number of things. On a kind of wider basis, the work that we contributed to in terms of the ticket office closures, we were really pleased to see that so many of them remained open after the consultation process. And I think that's an example of some of the bigger picture things that we can do, working much more in partnership with the Assembly and the GLA. But then very practically, there are a couple of things that are real grassroots, nitty-gritty things. For example, London terminuses, you no longer have to find 30 pence if you want to go to the loo. And that might sound like a mad thing, but having a 20 pence and a 10 pence, or being able to use that kind of machine, and you're in a rush and all that. I know it sounds crazy, but these are the kind of things that people don't always think about. So that sort of stuff, really important. I think we're also really proud of pushing TfL a little bit so that we've now got the red vest. So if you want to get some assistance, that's clear. And then just playing into the Healthy Streets agenda, really important for us. On the tube map, you've now got walking distances. And if you don't know the layout of London, it's a fantastic thing, the tube map. But, we all know that actually some of these places are really close. Now you can actually look and see, and I hope that that's helping to have more active life. So I hope what you see in here is a flavour of some of the ongoing work that we're doing. Going back to those first consumer principles, which is where we came from 20 years ago, there's a strong setting out at the beginning of this, and I think we want to come back to that. It's fairly timely now. The Mayor's strategy is looking ahead for the next 20 years, so we want to really be part of that solution. And getting into that, Anthony's going to talk a little bit about the future, but a key strand of making us more resourceful is actually coming together with more of a shared service arrangement with our sister organisation, Transport Focus. We have a different geography, a different focus in that sense, but we're dealing with many of the same issues, and it just seems completely crazy that we're not trying to make best use of resources. Now, some of that's going to take a little bit of time. For example, we want to co-locate. At the moment, our lease holds us for a period. Number of things. We're going to be streamlining the back office, and we have taken some hard decisions that, our finances have had a thorough review. I know that we're asking for some more money to get us through, but we are actually doing things to put our own house in order, and we are making redundancies at the moment. Obviously, that's a tricky thing for the staff concerned. We're quite a small team. But it is important that we do try and demonstrate the best possible value for money, because we're very mindful. We're funded by the public sector in a very tight time, and people out there deserve to know they've got the most efficient service that can possibly be there and the most useful one. I'll hand over to Anthony to talk a bit about the future.
Thank you, Chair. As the independent statutory watchdog for Britain's transport users, Transport Focus already has a lot of experience of working in Scotland, Wales, Manchester, Liverpool, across all sorts of modes of transport, bus, coach, tram and rail. And I think that strong base will be very helpful in our ongoing partnership with London TravelWatch. We've built Transport Focus as a consumer organisation. It's there to stick up for the users of all these forms of transport. We believe in choice and helping people to access better choices in terms of transport. Our aim is to be useful. We have no powers. We don't want any powers because other people have got those. Our job is to influence those that make decisions and who really hold a lot of power over our everyday lives and the transport we depend on. And crucially, we've got a very strong evidence base. We spend a third of our budget on talking to transport users about their current experiences and about their priorities for improvement for the future. And I think we can deploy a lot of that research much more usefully in and around London than perhaps we have been able to do in the past. So, and the aim of all this activity is to make a difference. At the end of the day, we're not a think tank. TravelWatch isn't a think tank. The job is to make transport better so that transport users have a better experience. Simple as that. Lots of good joined up work already going on. We're very conscious of the need to preserve the separate accountabilities and identities of the two organisations going forward. That's obviously very important. But I think the adding the two together creates more than the sum of its parts. It's a very powerful, exciting opportunity. And at the end of a year, we will come and ask all of you, is London TravelWatch now more useful to you in your role than it was 12 months ago? And I hope you'll all be able to say yes. I'm not going to say a majority vote, but I hope you're all going to say yes, because you have a very important task in scrutinising what's happening in and around London. We and TravelWatch can really help you do that, I think, in an effective way based upon evidence and powerful advocacy, and hopefully an increased presence in the media, increased social media presence in particular. So I think it's a very exciting opportunity, very much looking forward to this, and it's going to be interesting.
Thank you all for that introduction. And I think for Assembly members who have been on the Assembly before, prior to my election in 2016, this has been on the cards for quite a while, and I was reminded by Assembly Member Pigeon that 10 years, so we finally got there in terms of this proposed closer working relationship with London TravelWatch and Transport Focus, which used to be called Passenger Focus. You touched on but Joanna and Anthony touched on quite a number of the key elements of the business plan and going forward. And obviously, one of the things we've been looking at on the committee is the future of transport in London now, and the fact that London continues to grow, there continues to be increasing pressures. And Transport Focus having that national remit is fantastic. It will bring some additional benefits to us. But how are we going to ensure that the new director role will be enough to ensure that London's separate remit within the closer working relationship with TravelWatch and Transport Focus is not subsumed within the work that you're going to be doing going forward?
Perhaps if I can start with that and then Anthony can just carry on. I think it's an incredibly important question. It's something that's really very much in the mind of everybody at TravelWatch. There are a couple of very practical things that we're planning to do. The first one is to revise the Memorandum of Understanding that we have between London TravelWatch and the Assembly. And that's really the guiding kind of force for how we do business, or rather it should be. Sadly, sometimes in the past, I think if we'd lived up to that, we perhaps wouldn't have been where we've been in the last few years. But for the future, it's already got a lot of really good substance. And obviously, subject to decisions of members today, the plan will be to actually amend that to add things in to completely tie that back in terms of that reporting accountability. In terms of recruitment, the plan is that this will be a recruitment that's carried out jointly, and we hope, Chair, that you will be able to be part of the panel that actually appoints the new director. So I think that's really important, because whoever's appointed, you have to feel comfortable. This is a person that can work for you. This new person will be the key link person with the Assembly, and so we'll talk a bit more about that. We're also making sure that it's clearly written into the job description, obviously, and specification. And then, of course, the monitoring is going to be very important, both by the TravelWatch board. Arthur may want to say something about that, but also obviously back here via the Secretariat back to yourselves as the Transport Committee. So incredibly important question, and one that's very much on everyone's minds.
I think there's a very clear need for prioritisation here in the work plan. I think you need a sense of what you're getting for the money that you're spending at London TravelWatch, and we've got a very effective time recording system whereby we can track and predict use of time. So I think at the outset of the year we just need to be very clear with you that this is the number of hours that you've purchased, this is where we intend to spend this money at London TravelWatch, this is what the aim is, this is what the results are. And I think a very tight work plan is very key to that. Obviously events always happen which blow you off course, but we'll start at the beginning of the year with, I hope, with a much better sense of priorities, which is much better matched to what you are trying to achieve with your own work plan.
I'd just like to add, Chair, as Joanna mentioned about the board, it's key that the board is separate from the Transport Focus Board, although I am a member of the Transport Focus Board, but that's the link. But in terms of recruitment and in terms of holding that person to account, absolutely that will be the role of the London TravelWatch Board.
And maybe we could just ask the Secretariat to make sure we've got a robust system in place to ensure that, monitoring it.
If we note in the minutes that we would want Ed Williams in his role, Executive Director, to monitor for that and report back to the Transport Committee.
I think we ought to just make sure we've got a clear process on that. I wanted to ask you, and I don't know who would like to answer, it might be Joanna and Arthur, whether Anthony might want to in the second half. Can you outline for us 3 successes you've had in the last year, and 3 areas perhaps you want to focus on in the coming year? I think I asked this last year and I didn't really get an answer, so I'm hoping, Arthur, to hear some.
Shall I start with these? I mean, Joanna's touched on a couple of these, and I think they are important and very visible successes. And a mix really of the short term and the long term. Joanna mentioned about the free toilets at major stations. That was quite a short term campaign. It was we spoke to Network Rail. We said this was an unfair system, particularly as people couldn't use toilets on trains. And quite quickly, Network Rail said yes, we can see the purpose behind that. So that was quite a short term one. But in the longer term, we have campaigned for some time about the visibility of staff at stations, and that's been an important issue for users. There's been some resistance to that over 2 or 3 years, but we kept hammering away at this, and I think we've seen the success of that as a result of the report that we had for the Mayor about better use of staff and better visibility of staff. And then I think we've also had the broader success in terms of what we're actually doing at station ticket offices. Obviously that was a very important announcement in terms of 51 ticket offices closing. We pulled together all the evidence, a lot of evidence, and much of that came from members of the committee. And we said that this is not going to serve the user well. And as a result of that, 47 of those ticket offices are actually remaining open. So I think those have been real achievements for users in the last year.
In terms of the uniform point, are you sure every station the staff are wearing the tabards, and are you doing any monitoring of that?
Yes, Joanna may want to say more.
We've got some mystery shopping and spot checking. Obviously can't be everywhere all the time, but we do deploy our staff out there. I think one of the things the future we need to be a bit smarter about is, are there other mechanisms? And one of the great things about working with Anthony's team is the Transport Users Panel membership they already have in London. It's much more substantial than ours is. So we need to just use the resources that are there and, ask the questions and get the voice of the people coming back to us, because just a few staff going out there every so often is all very well, but there are much more modern ways of doing these things now, but we'll have access into much better resources for the future.
And then going forward, what are the areas? Obviously, we've got a much clearer idea of some of your priorities, but what are the sort of 3 things you hope to focus on in the next year? I don't know whether that's Arthur or Anthony.
Well, if I could kind of pick up, and then Anthony will sort of add some things in. I think if I can talk about 3 areas, and there are probably more than 3 things, but the first thing, obviously, the internal focusing bit is to get our house in order and to be absolutely certain we've got it nailed, you're happy, and that we've sorted the partnership and all the rest of it. So I think that's a given. It's easy not to say it, but it's actually really important, because we need to be demonstrating that partly value for money, but also get the culture right between the 2 organisations. Because if we don't get that right and the relationships right, then everything else is made of sand. And we've seen that with the relationships not working previously. But in terms of externally facing, very much better use of the transport user's voice. So one of the great things that's actually available at the moment that's never been properly utilised is the National Rail Passenger Survey. It covers London, but has it ever been something that's come back here we've utilised it in a broader way? We're currently talking about the questions for next year to see whether or not, and actually the answer is yes, those can be slightly tailored to be a bit more London specific. So for example, in terms of payment types, having Freedom Pass in there, making sure on the disability accessibility side we're a bit more specific. So I think showing that back and actually utilising this is incredibly important. Anthony may want to say a little bit more in the future. But in terms of that more external-facing policy and campaigning, there are two big campaigns. I know this is more than three, but one is the work that's come actually from people in our team on penalty fares when it's become clear that the operators have been misinterpreting the regulations, people are being overcharged. We've spotted by somebody in our little casework team, sussed this a few months ago, and it's now something that's sort of out there. DFT, the latest was rather pathetic, sorry, that's being minuted, letter we got back from them the other day. But things are starting to happen with some of the operators. It may be that's all done and dusted this year, but I fear that will go into next year. So we need to keep hold of that. But the delay repay, at the moment, I think it's 35% of people are claiming that is way too low. So together, that's something that's really meaningful, particularly at a time of economic difficulty for everybody, that just feel incredibly important. But I'm stealing Anthony's thunder.
Yep. So 3 examples, Chair. The delay repay campaign, I think, is a very important thing. All of our research shows and all of your knowledge will back up the fact people want reliable transport networks. That's the key thing we want. We want the timetable. That's what we've paid for. So getting people to claim compensation that's due to them is really, really important because it sends a very clear message to the industry about how important this is. So we've started a campaign encouraging people to claim, and also underneath that trying to make it easier to actually claim, because some of the claims processes are Byzantine, to put it mildly. They're very complicated. So really using that consumer power to really reach into the people, into the transport industry. On buses, for example, we've done a lot of work on buses and young people and young people's attitude to bus use. Members will be aware that bus use outside of London is pretty much declining as well. There's some good patches, but it's generally declining. If we're all going to use more sustainable forms of transport, you've got to nudge people into bus use in particular. And so I think the research we've done around that can be helpful to TravelWatch and to TfL possibly as well. Big campaign in the West Midlands we've just launched, which Andy Street came and kicked off in Wolverhampton, about Give Bus a Go, and really finding out what people's experiences are day to day. And on roads, the work we do with Highways England, a lot of work around helping Highways England understand the impact of roadworks on users and getting them to clear them up quicker, get them done quicker, tell people what's happening, when is it going to be finished, because investment's great, but when it disrupts your daily drive, it's not great. And there's a lot of roadworks around London, I noticed. So I think lots of those areas. And longer term, you'll be conscious, the members will be aware of the Williams Rail Review that the government is currently conducting into the structure of the rail industry. We've had a huge input into that, making sure it's passenger and user focused, and I think in time that will produce lots of benefits.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bowley, quick.
So just to go back to the sort of joining of two organisations. So in one sense, we're going to have a loss of capacity because you said you're making redundancies, but we're looking to take on this director. Are we gaining capacity by losing these people but taking on this director? Because we'll have less people.
Well, I think,
and I'm concerned that we have a national organisation that seems very well organised. Are we going to get lost because we just won't have enough bodies to do what you're meant to be doing?
It's a really good question, Assembly Member. If I can answer that in several ways. I think it's important that there actually is somebody at a senior level, because one of the important things about making sure the voice isn't lost is that somebody who's credible enough to work with senior people here, work with others and be credible within TfL. If you just send somebody junior along with the best will in the world, they're not necessarily going to get the doors opened in the right kind of way. So I think that is important. Now, whether or not in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, when things are actually perhaps in a different place, you might want to revisit that. I think everyone's going to be absolutely open in terms of doing that. Now, we are reducing in terms of staff. We've started with basically stripping away anything left in terms of admin resource we've got. What we're getting is being able to reduce some of the duplication that frankly does exist between the two organisations. We've got a similar remit, and it is bonkers that actually we've got not huge amounts, but there is some duplication. And of course we are talking about small numbers here. So we want to be more effective to say, between us, what have we got in terms of specific knowledge? Where are the things where it's mad? So at the moment, currently, there's a consultation on rail. We both answer it. We've now started to change that a little bit. So there's one on climate change recently, and actually it was Tim in our office did the most work on it because of the best expertise, and that was then shared with colleagues here. So there's a lot more of that can happen for the future. I think my fear for our organisation down the line, if we don't do something like this, is that in the search for efficiencies, because we're tied into pay awards, central government pension scheme, we can't contain our costs. 80% at the moment, it's going to be 90% next year of our cost is staffing, because we don't really have a research budget any longer, which is mad. We need to be in the position that we can put some money back into that. We're doing mostly secondary research. So we've got a cost level that's really difficult because we're squeezing down, there's not much left to squeeze back down on. So unless we can find more innovative ways of doing things, and one of the other benefits about being nested in a bigger team is the ability to actually bid for other money and other resources. And one of the reasons that we really like Transport Focus is that they're very good at getting other money in. And Anthony's got a great track record over the last few years of actually diversifying the income base of Transport Focus. But you can only do that if you've got the capacity for someone to write the grant bids and so on. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. The smaller you get, the less able you are to do things. But being that little bit bigger, you don't need, the risks that we both face are pretty similar. And at the moment we're doing things very separately. So there's a lot we can do just to be a bit more modern in approach.
I understand the cost base, that's a very strong argument. But when you answer the survey, don't you answer the survey from a national point of view? And when you answer, don't you answer from a London point of view?
Yeah, but there's a core in the middle that's quite similar. So some of the bits on, so if you take many of the issues are similar. Now, some of them aren't. So if you're coming into London, if you're a commuter, you want to make sure that train stops all the way into town. If you're from somewhere miles away, you want it to go very quickly. So there will be things occasionally that are very different for London. And obviously London's volume, it's not, I previously worked in an area that was quite rural. Very different issues there in terms of transport issues to actually being in the biggest city, one of the biggest cities in the world. So there are some things that are different, and clearly the nature of having TfL as a transport authority and all the other things too is very different. It's a very different operating environment.
I understand it's different. What I'm getting at is, will we lose the ability to represent that?
No, that's the whole point of having somebody at a senior level to be able to make sure that level's there.
So we will be adjusting
Sorry, I'm not answering properly.
For example, at the moment, the survey simply asks passengers, how was the journey you've just completed? So it's not badged as London or elsewhere. It's simply asking rail passengers, how was the journey you've just done? Then behind the scenes, we work out which train they were on, which area they're on, and we can cut the data in that way and put the appropriate badge on it. So you will gain more from this, I absolutely assure you. And it's very interesting that Arthur's colleagues on the Transport Focus Board and some of my staff colleagues outside of London have exactly the opposite worry, that we'll get sucked up by London, because of course London attracts quite a lot of attention. So we're very aware of this kind of tension between the two, and we will manage it, because London and South East is key to the success of the whole United Kingdom, and getting that right is absolutely crucial. And we will get more from the money that you are going to spend on TravelWatch. And yes, the staffing complement may be reducing slightly, but I think by avoiding duplication and increasing productivity, you will get more for your money.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just to note that we will be reviewing this on a periodic basis from the Transport Committee, and we definitely look forward to a more closer working relationship, making sure that the focus for London remains central and that we are focusing on the passenger journey. Just to say to committee members, can we approve the business plan and the budget bid for 2020-21? Agreed. Thank you very much, Argus.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for coming.
We're going to have a slight pause now as we do a changeover of guests.
GLA, chamber, sound. 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 GLA, chamber, sound.
Just to welcome everybody back to the second part of our Transport Committee meeting this morning. For this next session, we are looking at accessible and inclusive transport across London. Welcome our guests this morning. We have Staynton Brown, who's the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Talent at TfL. We have Christina Calderato, who's the Head of Transport Strategy and Planning at TfL. We have Helen McAllister, Head of Strategic Planning at Network Rail. Kirsty Hoyle, who's the CEO at Transport for All. And Benson, who's the Chair of Transport for All. So welcome to all of you this morning to our committee. So when you look at London, there are a number of barriers which affects a number of people's daily travel, and it's estimated that 19% of Londoners have a disability recognised under the Equality Act. And in the Mayor's transport strategy, it states that the transport system needs to cater for journeys made by people with a range of visible and invisible disabilities. So just a general question from me to everyone on the panel. Do you think that there's been enough progress to ensure that everyone in London can travel spontaneously and independently? Who wants to kick us off? I'm looking at you, Staynton.
I'll kick off. I think we've made reasonable progress so far, but there is so much more to do. We are, of course, in the most diverse city, we think, anywhere in the world. And we reflect that diversity in the design of everything we do across the transport network. We've made good progress. We'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later with regard to the building of step-free stations. That's, of course, incredibly important for people across London. But we also need to go quite a bit further in making sure that we are addressing the needs of people who sometimes have more hidden disabilities. We've done a number of things like the Please Offer Me a Seat campaign that you'd have seen more recently, which is changing public perception and public confidence in allowing people who typically wouldn't get a seat on a tube to be able to get a seat as well as on buses. We're improving near and real-time information also for passengers. Where a lift might be out of order or people need to be redirected. And we're also thinking very carefully about the design of our streetscape as well to ensure that people who have a mobility impairment, those people perhaps who have a cognitive condition like dementia, are adequately given consideration into the designs of the city. So I think we have done a huge amount to date. We can go into some more detail, I think, as the session progresses, but there's a lot more to do. One of the things which we are currently working on strategically is our new action on inclusion strategy, and I would welcome bringing that back to the committee once that strategy has been fully signed off and completed, and also getting your views today will be very helpful in helping to inform that strategy.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is that, so talking about disabled groups particularly, but when you think about all kind of protected characteristics, many people, probably most people in London, belong to one or more of those groups. We're actually talking about everybody, and so when you try and make the network more inclusive for disabled people or for any one of those protected characteristics, you make it better for everybody, and that's how we get to a really kind of inclusive system, and that's what we're trying to do with the inclusive design and putting people at the heart of that.
I think from a Network Rail perspective, I'd echo the themes that you've just raised. I think we've come a very long way over the past 10, 15 years or so. There's been huge investment in the rail network via especially the Access for All programme, but we've also managed to introduce things like our inclusive design strategy and how we can enable more people to access the railway more easily. Having said that, there is still a lot more that we can do, and we are now trying to move to look at people using the railway from an end-to-end perspective, from when they decide to travel to what are all the barriers they might face until they get to their end destination, which is not when they get to one of our managed stations and when they leave one of our managed stations, because that's not how I think when I want to make a journey. And by doing that, I think we can then work even more collaboratively across industry and put more things in place that will help, again, more people. And I really would echo the point that when you address barriers to those who have both visible or invisible disabilities, you are actually making the system easier for everyone to use. So you're raising the standards and the quality of provision for all people.
Yeah, thank you. To pick up on two of Helen's points there, I think one of the, while we applaud and are, and work with many partners across the sector to support many of these initiatives, one of the biggest issues facing deaf, disabled and older Londoners who we represent is the sort of inconsistency in approach. So I think you're right about the collaboration and the end-to-end or the door-to-door, how we term it, in terms of we need to think about people's journeys. But at the moment, turn up and go might not work in one area, but it might in another. I might go to one bus company and understand that they've had a level of training that means they both understand and care for my needs, but then I go to another bus company, I don't. So this reduces confidence, it increases social isolation, and it reduces the well-being of disabled passengers. It also reduces their ability to get access to joy, to employment opportunities. So I think we are very pleased with some of the singular developments, but in our opinion, there needs to be a broader systemic change in agreement that then filters down so that disabled people have more confidence when they travel.
I don't wish to start off on a negative note, but the short answer is no. A third of the underground stations are accessible. That means 2/3 of them aren't accessible to me. Particularly this week, for example, the Extinction Rebellion disruption. People can use the underground, but if you can't use the underground in central London, getting around, taxis, which are a frequent solution for disabled people, they're quite impractical at the moment. So there are still some serious barriers. I would support everything that's been said about progress that has been made. There are an enormous number of steps forward over the past, particularly 5 to 7 years. Things like staff training has improved to no end. Attitudes in staff as a result of that have changed to no end. We have had improvements in the step-free network, but there are still things like the Waterloo and City line, which is now step-free, but it's closed, the lifts are closed for most of the day. So we've got an infrastructure there that is physically accessible, but I still can't use it.
Yeah.
So there are still some inconsistencies that we need to look at.
No, thank you for that. And I saw your tweets on that, Alan, where both lifts were closed. I spoke to Southwark Pensioners Group last Friday and just outlining some of the issues that's been raised. And one of the questions that they asked me was, well, what do you mean by an inclusive and accessible public transport network? And I said, actually, we've got a session on this next week and I'll ask the panel. So what does that actually mean and what does that look like?
So I think historically, transport providers have looked at accessibility, meaning mostly the built environment and design in of things like ramps for people who are in a wheelchair. And so that's predominantly been the narrative in relation to accessibility. But what we're wanting to do, as everyone on the panel has of course advocated for, is to move towards inclusive design. This is consistent with many metros around the world, and very simply, it means making sure that we have the right evidence base, and we look at the breadth of needs that different groups perhaps have, which stops them accessing the public transport network, and that we use that evidence base to then inform what we do. So we design in the needs and requirements of people, rather than we make a decision and then look to retrofit it later down the line. One of the things that we will be doing is really enhancing and improving that evidence base. So what are the differences of experiences on the public transport network if you are a woman, for example? What are the variable experiences of being on the public transport network if you're an older person? So it's putting all of those things together to make sure that we are being wholly inclusive from the outset, informing all that we do.
I'd like to Staynton's point. I think underpinning that also is that we hope that an inclusive and accessible transport environment, because it's about streets, not just about physical infrastructure that a particular provider can make change to, should adhere to the social model of disability. And as Staynton was saying, if things are built by, with and for the people that they are for, then they will. So in terms of the social model of disability, we want a transport environment that gives parity to people's ability to travel independently and as seamlessly as possible. And that's what we think really is inclusive. Now, in our city, there are elements of that will always be difficult, but we can look far more at attitudinal barriers, as well as we're trying to improve infrastructure. So we think it has to be a dual approach.
So I was just going to say, I think the key that we're talking about here is the end-to-end journey, the door-to-door experience. So for any one of the Assembly members here, the trip from your house to here is not something you really need to think about. It's just something that you do, it's part of your daily experience. The issue for many disabled people is those trips need thinking about. There are routing problems. There are what happens if staff aren't there to assist blind, partially sighted people. What happens if ramps aren't there? What happens if the environment is visually noisy, overwhelming? What equipment do I need to take with me? So I carry with me a T-key, which is a piece of kit that unlocks ramps on stations. And lots of disabled people carry them because staff don't have them. So I've got to plan ahead to overcome the inadequacies of the system. So an inclusive transport system would be, I don't need to do any of that. I make the same journey that you do.
No, thank you for that. From a network role perspective, Helen?
So from my perspective, an accessible transport system is one that is physically capable of enabling people to use it. An inclusive transport system is one that offers the kind of equality of opportunity for people to use that system in the same way. So as you're saying, you need to plan your journeys and think about your journeys. If we were truly inclusive, then everybody would just be able to turn up and not think about it like that. So I think there is a difference between having something that is accessible in a very practical sense and something that is truly inclusive for all people, whether they have a visible, invisible or temporary disability. And I think historically we've been improving at that practical accessibility side, and it's only in the past kind of 5 years or so that we've really started thinking about the inclusivity side of it and the softer side, to give people confidence that they can use the system, to change the attitudes that we have for customer service and the information that we provide, and considering the needs of all people when we're making transport decisions, not just thinking we need to make sure there's a lift at this station, because yes, that's necessary, but it's not the end of the story, and it's most definitely not the full answer.
In terms of looking at how we get to an accessible and inclusive transport system, obviously in the Mayor's transport strategy there's an accessibility improvement plan which sets a timescale for improving that accessibility across the network. And we touched on some of the areas where we think there's a barrier. Where do you think those improvements are needed the most if you look at the transport system across London now? Kirsty?
In terms of, one of the issues here is that there is no transparency for disabled, older and deaf Londoners in terms of where the decisions are made. So rather than saying we want Bank to be step-free or we want Waterloo to have better level boarding, really what we want is to understand the planning, why it happens, and the criteria upon which those decisions are predicated. So that's what I think is actually, to be honest, Florence, is more important than, specific example is people being part of that process for two reasons. A, so they can understand and influence it, but B, so they can be part of development rather than constantly feeling that they are arguing against something. We're often not involved. I think that disabled people are starting, because of the 20 years of history that Alan and others have led, to realise that this is their right, it's not charity. So I think really we need to be aiming to make everything as accessible as possible. But in terms of the main issues are transparency, involving people, and being clear about the reason, the rationale to both disabled people and to all society that this is a right, it's not charity. So I know that's not exactly answering your point directly, Florence, but I think it is an important part.
Definitely a valid point.
Speak to that briefly. I think so. We definitely try and work as far as possible with stakeholders on making some of those decisions, and I'm sure there's more that we could do. But we have a valuing people group. People have different learning disabilities. We have an independent disability advisory group who work with us on our schemes, and of course we do public consultation and reach out to people that way. But we're also thinking about how we can build on this and make that feel more meaningful. So, for example, with step-free access, it is the physical accessibility, but I think it's a good example of how we're kind of changing our approach to that decision-making, where a lot of it has been we've decided how we take forward step-free stations based on cost and deliverability to try and get that kind of as many in as we can. But for the next tranche of that programme, what we need to do is start thinking about talking to people who use lifts and finding out whether it's more valuable if we do one complex station or whether we do lots of stations, whether we do it where we're kind of plugging a gap, or whether it's more important to have it as part of a hub. So that's definitely, we're trying to push forward on that front to make sure that we are working with people and putting in exactly what they need, informed by what they're telling us.
I appreciate that, but IDAG in particular, I would like to make a point about that. So IDAG is the Independent Disability Advisory Group that TfL use as a sounding board for the majority of things that involve people with impairments. Is that correct? Would you?
Not wholly. IDAG have been recruited as experts. They are people who are leaders in their field, have a good understanding of transport and also the lived experience of having a disability. So they're an advisory group that we regularly refer to help improve decision making for all schemes which are developed across the organisation. But we also have national stakeholders as well. So we now much more proactively, I would say, than we did in the past, engage with national and regional stakeholders. And we have a national and regional stakeholder team that go out and consult and engage to help inform some of what we do in the organisation. So there are a number of touch points as well as our borough teams as well, where there is a scheme or planned works within the borough, they will go out not just to local authorities but also capture the views of local community groups. And so we engage and consult with lots of different groups, and perhaps there's a question as to how we make sure that's much more kind of transparent and people are more aware of how those consultations and how those discussions have helped to then inform what we do as an organisation.
So just on that group then, I mentioned I met with Southwark Pensioners Forum last week, and every single one of them outlined a number of issues that they've had both on the train and the tube. How would I feed that in? How would they know when there are relevant sessions taking place with IDAC? Which stakeholders do you meet with, just as an example?
Well, I think that would be led by our borough engagement team. They would be the right people to go to. I can pull together more detail for you once the session is complete.
I think that would be helpful if we could just get some examples of the different stakeholders.
Do you feel
that
I do have a point
works?
on that, Florence. Yeah, the reason I mentioned it is there is a couple of examples, I won't name specifically, but where I've approached TfL and IDAG have been one of the only filters that has been used, and that is a closed group of 10 individuals, as I understand it, who are paid. And it's my opinion that that is too narrow a filter for the 1.8 million Londoners whose voice need to be heard. I'm not making a comment on the individual abilities of people in that group quite. So I've asked for two things from IDAG. I've asked for an open chair at each meeting that's rolling that can be a different person, and I've also asked for all the minutes to be made public as well, so that we're able to see what's being said on our behalf.
Just on that, Christina and Staynton, are we able to get membership of the IDAG board and just get a bit more information about how?
That. I think just to reassure though that we don't use IDAG as being entirely representative of all of London, and I think we're not even necessarily using them to sound out on those particular issues. It's taking our kind of everyday business through IDAG just to make sure that we're not ever doing anything in isolation and only taking things like step-free access to IDAG, that we're actually taking, I don't know,
car-free day.
Yeah, and anything that we might be doing just to make sure that we have a kind of rounded sounding board internally. So it's absolutely not intended to replace wider engagement. Okay. It's just one of the things that we have, but it is internal and we do use them, so that we have that kind of constant feedback.
Did you want to
it's worth saying, whilst we have reservations about IDAG, they are people that we respect, and they do have a role. But I think one of the issues is that it's not just TfL that we're talking about. We've got all of the bus companies, we've got all of the train companies, and they don't have any kind of similar professional advice. One thing that's very common is disabled people are asked to give opinions, give their expertise for no return, no reward. You wouldn't ask an architect for their opinion or a lawyer for their opinion without offering some kind of quid pro quo. Yeah. But that's done to disabled people all the time. And if you want, frankly, professional quality advice, you need to pay for it.
No, thank you, very valuable. Was there anything you wanted to add on that in terms of where improvements may be needed to be made, Helen, from a Network Rail perspective?
We are in the final stages now of writing up a Railway for Everyone study, which looked at the end-to-end journey of people and what the barriers are for transport during, and what could be done to address them. Pardon me. One of the things we did during that study was hold a series of workshops around the country to which we invited a broad number of stakeholders, including people with direct lived experience of disability and their representative bodies, to come along and to ask them what the barriers are that they face that are broader than physical accessibility. And the three things that came out kind of really strongly that we need to improve on as a rail industry, but also as a transport sector, is consistency of service provision, whether it's consistency across the country or consistency between different modes of transport. communication of what that service provision is and what people can expect and what assistance is available, both in terms of physical assistance but also cost assistance to use the railway, and then the kind of cultural shift, the softer side of people that they engage with in the transport network needs to understand where they're coming from, understand that they have additional needs and what they might be, but not just when they're asked, as almost an instinctive thought. And I think those things don't need a lot of money throwing at them in order to make improvements. We're doing things at the moment, like all our station staff at our managed stations have training that is designed and in parts delivered by people with lived experience of disability. And we need to do more of that across our organisation, not just with the public-facing part of our organisation, so that the decisions that we make become truly kind of instinctual. And I think that will lead to some of the bigger benefits. But then also working across industry so that we get more of a consistency in service provision and understand where there are areas of best practice and they can be translated across train operators or across infrastructure sectors, or across different stations, whether they're owned and managed by Network Rail or not.
I'm afraid controversially, I want to challenge that a little bit. The training that TfL deliver, and I need to declare interest because we're involved in the groups that deliver that training is delivered and designed by disabled people. The training that the rail companies tend to provide, the consultancy may just be asking a couple of people what they think. I've seen cases where the train company training for accessibility is delivered by the same people that deliver their health and safety training, which is, to us, is just shocking. It needs to be delivered and designed by the people that are affected by the issues.
I would absolutely agree with that, and that is something that very much came out of the consultation work that we did, that in order to be truly effective, training has to be designed and input and ideally partly or fully delivered by people who have lived experience. I can come back about exactly how the Network Rail managed stations training works, but I think there are some operators, train operating companies, who have good practice, and some who have practice that meets the standards that's out there. And one of the areas for improvement is taking those areas of really good practice and trying to get that at a more consistent level across the system.
Yeah, just mindful of time. Just really quickly, what's the timescale for Railway for Everyone?
We're finalising it at the moment to come out for more consultation. It should be out for consultation before the end of the year.
Okay, great. If you could let us know some of those dates so that we can look at that. Caroline.
So to pick up the minutes point, Kirsty, you said that you've been asking for minutes from the independent group. Is that something TfL will be publishing?
I'm happy to write to you after the session. I would be happy to share the outcome.
Why wouldn't you want to?
There's no reason why we wouldn't. So more than happy to share the outcome of those discussions. That's absolutely fine.
That would be helpful. Before we move on to the second session, which is looking at London streets, my apologies. I was supposed to introduce a short video, which would have helped us in terms of setting the scene for this morning's discussion. So we'll just go to that very quickly, so everyone can turn to their monitors. Just shows someone's journey.
I have Asperger's syndrome, which is a type of autism, and I also have scoliosis of the spine, so I have a curve up at the top of my back where there shouldn't be one. Both of those conditions have an impact on me travelling around London, trains and buses. It can be really difficult sometimes being autistic, getting on a public transport mode in general, because I'm so nervous about the fact there's going to be lots of people on there. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a seat. I have a blue badge because I have scoliosis of the spine. I need to sit when I'm travelling. If I stand on a moving vehicle like a bus, it will give me spasms up my back, which can leave me in pain for hours on end. So probably the best example of a really bad day was a couple of weeks ago when the Northern Line was shut. I got off my usual train at King's Cross, walked out to the buses at the front, and instead of there being 20 or so people at my bus stop. There was hundreds of people. And it was quite terrifying, really, because I didn't actually know when I'd be able to get a bus. I didn't know what was going on at first, because there was no communication anywhere telling me the Northern Line was shut. It was just suddenly there were lots more people trying to get my bus. Seeing a huge crowd of people, it's like you've been punched in the stomach. There's suddenly this huge twist of anxiety. Everything goes tense. You go into flight or fright mode, and it's just like, oh my God, how am I going to cope with this? And this is right at the start of the day. I haven't even made it into, got to do 8 hours of work. My buses at King's Cross come from Euston, so they're generally quite full when they arrive anyway. So if I'm not one of the first 3 people on the bus, I don't get a seat at all. And even wearing the badge doesn't necessarily work, because people don't look up, and you need to ask them to give you a seat. But being autistic, asking a stranger to do something for you it's a real no-no. So there's been a couple of times when I've had to stand. If I can get myself backed into a corner, I can just about be okay. One of the reasons I wear a backpack is so I have some cushioning. But even then, I'm feeling, as the legs are moving, as the bus is moving, those little shocks coming up my pelvis, they're wiggling the base of my spine, and it's then shooting pains coming all the way up my spine. It's like tiny little strands of white hot fire. It just stings everywhere. The perfect transport system would be one that runs very, very regularly with lots and lots of units or buses happening. So there's plenty of space for people to get on. Better communication would definitely be a thing. Not every bus stop in London has the sign telling you how many minutes till the next one. So sometimes you panic and you jump on the first one you see, because it might be 10 minutes you're standing there in the rain waiting for the next one.
And that's all before she's even got to work. Yeah. Okay. Moving on to our second session, looking at London streets. Assembly Member Bailey.
Good morning. Just before I ask these series of questions, you said that TfL does research and you use representative groups. Is there any arena to pass that information on to the bus companies so they can get some benefit from that?
Absolutely. We have a document called Understanding Our Diverse Communities, which is a compendium of all available research that looks at the demography of the city and differing experiences and needs. So it's a big document. It's about 170 odd pages of really in-depth research, which helps to inform our equality impact assessments, and we share the headlines with our contracted services too. So, for example, bus companies, we're just about to go out to tender for refreshed disability equality training. At the depots, there's regular training for bus drivers, and in 2016, you may already be aware that there was a big investment put into training all bus drivers to improve their customer experience and to ensure that disabled passengers were given a good quality of experience too. So we have huge amounts of research which helps to inform what we do and the requirements that we place on bus companies as well as other contracted services.
Okay, thank you. This is for everybody. What are the biggest barriers to everybody being able to access the streets of London?
Shall I start?
Why don't you? Thank you.
So the challenge on London streets is particularly difficult. There are obviously challenges in terms of parts of our underground network. They're very old, but the streets have so many different people using them and so many different purposes. So we have a real mix of users with motorists and cyclists and freight and pedestrians, and then you have a mix of stakeholders. So you have boroughs and businesses and people who want to use the streets, and they all might have slightly different needs. So we're trying to, through the Mayor's transport strategy, really take that healthy streets approach so that we tackle the streets where people spend the majority of their time. And that's trying to make sure that the streets are open and inclusive and work for all the people that need to use them, and making sure that everybody has the confidence to be in those places and spaces and make the most healthy and accessible journeys. And we know that there are community benefits for that as well, where we can improve integration, and that's how we have thriving businesses and communities, and people feel like they're able to kind of own and use their streets with confidence.
Yeah, I think, Sean, there's something very interesting about where the environmental developments and where access needs intersect. So things such as car-free day, shared space, dockless bikes, while are part of one agenda and are very supportive, and disabled people support active living and active travel and want to be part of the climate crisis as much as anybody. Quite often those very initiatives are disabling, and so something that we're seeing is that we're often coming in at the back of those initiatives once they're up and running and been agreed, and we're saying, listen, these are the reasons that these are discriminating against disabled people. So there's something interesting about the streets at the moment, that while we try to make the streets more accessible, we're reducing traffic, we just really need to consider the needs of those for whom using other types of modes of transport isn't a choice. So I think that's quite important.
I think it's also worth saying that part of the problem is the physical streets, the infrastructure, the obstructions, but part of the problem is people and the, I hesitate to use the word conflicts, but the different approaches that people have on the streets. So I'm sure Assemblyman and Russell will remember when we went out and just had a look around the Oval, and the cycle lanes around there where they intersect with the pedestrian environment, it's a bit of a free-for-all and can be excluding for disabled people that either can't or don't like to use those environments.
And what of this thing of the state of the pavements? Speaking to people, the state of the pavement seems to be a very big issue. Someone's talking me through that.
I guess I'm very well equipped. I think there's two issues. One is around the design of the pavements. So you've got increasingly obstructions that get in my way or that block the path of people that can't see where they're going. Things like the charging points, which are put on pavements rather than on roads. The pedestrian areas that are laid out with trees, benches, advertising signage, these sorts of things get in the way. They look very good, they look very pretty, but they're a problem. The other issue, of course, is maintenance. So as you, particularly for me, trees under pavements, the roots cause the pavements to be almost impassable sometimes. So there's a need there for maintenance and ongoing investment to keep them flat and level.
Because I understand some local authorities are now tarmacking rather than paving stones. Is this a good or a bad thing?
Cobbles are dreadful, and uneven, so particularly Greenwich is a particularly dreadful place to move around if you're on wheels. I think what tends to happen is, whether you're looking at tarmacking or flagstones, when they're laid initially, they're great, they're flat, they're level. It's then the maintenance. So if you maintain these surfaces, then that's great. But if you don't, then it doesn't really matter what the surface is. It's uncomfortable.
So it's more about the maintenance and the actual thing.
And also things like inconsiderate pavement parking. So lorries and cars crack the pavements up. So again, there's an issue of people's behaviour contributing to the problem.
Okay, just moving on slightly, I'll come back to pavement parking. The City of London is working to develop a street accessibility standard. Has TfL looked at this and considered working to deliver it across all the boroughs and other parts of London?
So we have our own streetscape guidance, which deals with many of the issues that you've raised, actually. So we recently updated that with a new section on electric vehicle charging points, and we're going to have a more comprehensive EV infrastructure installation guidance coming out at the end of this year. For example, in that streetscape guidance, we've updated that to say that where possible, those points should be built in pavement build-outs rather than going onto the pavement, and that you need at least 2.5 metres, which basically gives you enough space for 2 wheelchairs to pass each other while charging. So we do develop and keep updating our own guidance to try and make sure that we kind of make sure that the streetscape works for people. But in some of the things that you highlighted there, I think it highlights that, like you said, conflicts isn't a pleasant word, but there are tensions between the needs of different users, and things like trees and benches for other users, for people with mobility problems or older people, it's really important that they have somewhere they can stop and sit and rest on a journey. And it's trying to find the balance on our limited streetscape where we can kind of make that work. So yeah, within our own guidance, we definitely try and make sure that we leave enough in the pavement that wheelchair users can use them alongside everybody else. And we'll be working with the city as well to make sure that they're all aligned. But the important thing about the guidance is that it's at the moment boroughs aren't mandated to adopt that, so we're doing it. But there could be instances on borough roads, for example, where some of that infrastructure is placed not within 2.5 metres. So what we need is exactly that kind of the collaborative approach we've got with city in terms of boroughs making sure that we adopt those best practice standards.
So you've seen their standard, and I suppose the question is their standard good? Is it something that you would seek to help other boroughs to deliver, or is it just for them and your own guidelines are adequate?
I haven't seen cities accessibility guidance.
We're advising them on it. It's not ready yet. They're just doing the consultation part of it. Yeah.
Okay. And okay, let me just quickly move on. Should the rest of the country be looking at London's best practice around pavement parking? There are still challenges, or there's still big challenges to manage in London about pavement parking. So we think that, or it's been suggested that London's very good with pavement parking and the rest of the country should copy London. Is that the case, or do we have a lot to learn as well in London?
Anecdotally from our members, I would say that inner London, because of other restrictions, rather than people being appropriately parking their car, I think that's true, but I think that's because you're unable to, rather than because people make good choices, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, in Greater London, I don't think that's the case, but we don't have any statistics on there. But anecdotally, particularly in areas that are near schools or near other sort of conurbations, it is an issue for people. And it's an issue for people not only in terms of individuals in society, but also organisations, so deliveries. You know, there are many different people who use streets, who park up very briefly, but don't realise that 10 or 15 minutes, discriminates and disables somebody from being able to go about their day. So anecdotally and external, out of Greater London, no, it is still an issue.
I think I see that. I used to live right in the middle, and I live on the edge, and I never saw people park on the pavement really until I moved out. Because in town,
you can get away with it. That's kind of it, really. So people don't make good choices, but I would like to think that people, given the education of why that isn't a good choice, a good deal of them might not do it. I've done it, in the past and haven't realised that I'm disabling people or blocking people. I thought only of my needs. So I think that's possibly something that we could work on in terms of the public understanding of the impact of their actions. Okay. And that's true for a lot of access, actually.
Thank you. Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. Just picking up on the pavement parking thing, do the people from TfL have anything to say about the idea of doing some comms work around making it clear how antisocial and disabling it is to park on the pavement? And that also goes for lorries parking in bike lanes as well.
So I think we need to enforce against illegal or civil infringements of use of street space where we see it, and I think that's a really important part to make sure that where we do have rules that they're being observed. And in terms of communications, I think that's certainly something that we could look at taking forward.
I don't think you were saying rules though, just Caroline. It's also about going further than rules, isn't it? As in, it might not be a rule, but don't do it anyway because it's not fair or kind. And I think that the Department of Transport's new inclusive transport campaign is on that line as well. So there is going to be something like this that we can potentially feed into.
So, question for TfL. What progress has the Mayor made on lobbying government to make it easier for TfL and the boroughs to manage and remove street clutter?
So we have been lobbying government, for example, to be able to remove telephone booths so that we can remove some of those kind of slightly redundant street clutter. I don't think that we have been successful thus far in that. I think what we're trying to do is do what we can control, and as I say, through the streetscape guidance, we're trying to be really clear about removing the clutter that we don't need, putting in the things that we do need on our pavements, like some shade and shelter and seating, and making sure that we put them in a sympathetic way that supports the Mayor's transport strategy and our wider active travels agenda without disadvantaging people. So we're doing that where we have control of it on things like being able to remove old telephone booths. We haven't had that back from government.
Possible to let the committee know, to sort of actually find out where that research has got to on the old telephone booths, because those are, every high street across London has dead telephone boxes that get used as urinals and or places to store stuff. I mean, they're just...
we have. I think we have removed one as a kind of to see how that goes. But,
what, you mean just remove it?
Let me find out the
Maybe
details.
you better,
and come back to you.
come back to us on that. The other thing, just while we're on pavement clutter, good to hear that you've updated the guidance on the electric vehicle charging points. What is that guidance, or does it have any teeth? And is that for the TLRN, or is it for the boroughs as well?
So it's guidance to be used London-wide. So the street space guidance applies, and then the electric vehicle infrastructure guidance, which we're developing now, which we'll also publish, that came out of the EV infrastructure task force, will have more detail on that. And what boroughs have been saying to us is that they want this guidance, they want to understand how best to do it. So we're trying to give a really consistent, detailed approach so that people know how to do it in the best way. They're not compelled to do that. But we're adopting it on the TLRN and on our own roads, and encouraging boroughs and giving them the tools to be able to do it themselves. And that they are hungry for that information. So hopefully, by making sure that we get it out there, which was one of the big outputs from the task force in particular, we will start to see those changes coming through on our streets.
And just to be clear, did you say that's not yet published? Or?
So the streetscape guidance has been updated with a kind of new brief section on advice on where to place EV, particularly rapid chargers, so what they look like, where they should go, the best way to deal with them. But we will have a more kind of fulsome document, particularly around EV infrastructure, so that's slow chargers, rapid chargers, hubs. So that will be more comprehensive, and that's being drafted now and is not available yet, but will be in the coming months.
I mean, can you just give us is that by Christmas or?
It will be by spring, and it could be earlier than that. So I can update on a date.
Okay. If you could update us on a date when that will be expected, that would be really helpful. There's a range of barriers to people using non-standard bicycles when they're wanting to access cycling infrastructure. So people who use hand cycles, people who use bikes as mobility aids. Has TfL looked at this, and what are you doing to address it?
Yes, we have looked at it. I think one of the considerations that we've had to that we're actively thinking about are the size of some of those cycles and the width of some of the older cycle lanes. So we're actively working with a number of organisations just to understand the different types of mobility cycles. But we are really committed to getting more people with a disability cycling on our roads.
The other, so there's the issue of the width of the lanes, but there's also the issue of barriers, chicane type barriers that get put up very often when boroughs have a problem with mopeds tearing through little cut through walking or cycling routes, and they put up chicanes which actually make it harder for people in mobility scooters and wheelchairs and people pushing buggies, but particularly they make it very difficult for people using adapted cycles, and obviously for people using cargo bikes. So are you working on guidance in terms of those kind of chicane type barriers that get put up on pedestrian and cycling routes?
We are, and I think that is a perfect illustration of what our emerging inclusive design framework needs to address to make sure that in our cycling design standards, the world has moved on from say 5 or 10 years ago, and we're adequately reflecting the diversity of people who perhaps now want to cycle with technological advances that are more present today. So those are the types of considerations that will be drawn into the inclusive design framework that will then inform all of our design standards.
And what's the timescale on this inclusive design framework?
It's in train right now, so hope to have this ready by the spring. So we're looking at April or May in 2020, but it could well come sooner. It will be actively engaged and consulted upon, though, with regional, national partners, as well as Transport for All, IDAG, and other interested parties.
Does anyone else want to comment on what we've just been talking about, Helen?
I was just going to extend it slightly. There is an impression that disabled people don't use cycles of any kind, and as you pointed out, that's wrong, and they are a really useful mobility aid. I think one of the issues that we do have is getting to where you get to use the aid. So actually getting these cycles on trains, on transport, can be particularly difficult. So it would be good, particularly if the train companies would be flexible in carrying these aids.
So do you think it needs recognition that bicycles are being used as mobility aids? Is that something that is currently recognised, or is there a need for a sort of rules and regulations change? Helen, do you know anything about this at all?
I don't, frankly. I would go, my first port of call would be to go to the rail delivery group and ask them about what the different train operating companies have in place, which I can either do and then come back to you, or if you would like that, that would be
incredibly helpful. I mean, I've certainly heard, I mean, apart from following Alan's tales of his journeys on Twitter, I often get atted on Twitter by people who are travelling with non-standard bicycles and finding it very difficult to get them into the area on the train that they've booked their cycle. They've booked a place. I mean, it's difficult enough to get a bike on a train anyway, because there's only space for two in a carriage. But if you've got a non-standard bike, and also if you have a disability, it can be hard to actually lift your bike to fit where it's meant to go. So it would be helpful to understand what the rail delivery group would think on that.
It can be something as simple as being asked to dismount whilst you're crossing a station. It's that obvious.
Sorry, that people are asked to dismount?
People are asked to dismount from their cycles as they go across the station. If they're using them as a mobility aid, that's an issue.
Yes. So that would be a staff training issue in terms of an understanding about bikes being used as mobility aids. And also, I think it was Kirsty you mentioned earlier, or maybe it was Alan, that for most of us, we don't have to think about our journey from home to work. You know, we just get on and do it. But again, if you're using a bike as a mobility aid, that's part of the ease of you getting to the station in the first place, to be able to get on that train.
I want to add very quickly that this is also something that Will, Cycling and Walking Commissioner, is very much on top of too. We've had a number of discussions over the last year as to how we can adapt and signal that we more formally recognise different types of cycles as mobility aids, and that's something that is being looked at as part of the active travel piece that he's responsible for.
Yeah. The next question, I'm going to start with you, Helen, for Network Rail, but I'd be interested in what other people have to say as well. This is about the accessibility of the area immediately surrounding a station. And we've the Transport Committee have done visits with Transport for All to stations and have just witnessed it's that sort of, even if the station itself has level access, the sort of accessing the station from the pavements, the streets, the local buses, there's all sorts of bits that it's like it's fallen between the cracks. No one's actually thought about how that interface between the station and the world of the street kind of actually works. So just to start with, how is Network Rail working with stakeholders to improve the accessibility of the areas surrounding stations?
I think, to begin with, the fact that we now have a greater focus on the whole journey and therefore transport between people moving between modes of transport, so the very thing that you're talking about, getting from the buses to the trains or from the roads into the station, there is now a greater awareness of that as an area that needs to be addressed. We would always be interested in working with other parties around our stations to make that better. It's difficult because there are not often the easy opportunities. So the opportunities generally arise when there is already a big infrastructure project occurring. So for somewhere like King's Cross Station or London Bridge, where there's kind of been full remodels and we've been able to take the needs of disabled users into account right back at the design stages, we can then talk to Transport for London and other engaged parties about, okay, so how do we make those interchanges better and how do we think about that interface on an ad hoc basis. It's very difficult to do and to find the opportunity to do, although we are always willing to engage to look at doing that. The two areas that we can impact on most, I think, at the moment are when we are doing broader works at some of the managed stations to make sure that we look at that interface and manage it as smoothly as possible, so London Bridge, but also at Euston Station at the moment, although there is step-free access into the station from the buses and out onto the streets, it can be a little bit convoluted, and we're looking to see if we can add an additional entrance into the station at the platform one end. I don't know how familiar people are with Euston, but if you can get directly onto Eversholt Street from Melton, from inside the station, that then cuts out a whole swathe of going around the houses, frankly, to get in at the front.
Is that kind of temporary access you're talking about, or are you talking about that as a permanent fix?
I am not certain, but I can come back on that. But it's definitely something that will improve things in the shorter term. The other area where we can assist with that accessibility, more broad accessibility, is looking at the overcrowding around some of the London stations, train stations. And we have a list of the most overcrowded stations at the moment, and we are working with the FT to identify what the interventions would need to be to make them less overcrowded. So, for example, at Denmark Hill, we now have funding to develop a full business case to put a second entrance in to try and stop people spilling out onto the streets, which is an issue for people who have faced barriers to mobility barriers, but will also improve the situation for everyone.
Does TfL have any kind of programme of kind of assessing access around stations?
Yeah, so in a kind of similar way, it's that whole journey approach. So it's not just about going where's the boundary of the station, but it's looking at how you access that station and making sure that we have, in the same way that we have a healthy streets approach, we have a healthy stations approach, and that actually that having an accessible station is no good if you can't get to it. So we're absolutely building that into the inclusive design piece that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, from my personal experience, I went on a journey with Helen, I think about 18 or so months ago, and what was very clear was that when we don't adopt that kind of whole station approach, the additional amount of time disabled passengers in particular take to be able to make relatively straightforward journeys is not acceptable. So we need to think much more holistically and look at the kind of wider built environment around a station and it's moving beyond looking at things through each mode, but looking at how we design our services around a real customer journey, which is the reframing, which Christina and I have spoken about in terms of the inclusive national inclusion strategy that we are currently developing.
Some really simple things that don't happen, and I think that's because staff don't think about it. So if staff in a station understood that going outside and doing a really quick visual audit, knocking on a restaurant door and saying, can you just move that sign because it blocks the way for wheelchair users or for people using the street to come in, it would make a huge difference. But those people won't necessarily have any experience in their personal life to know that that's something that's needed. And that's why it's the responsibility of TfL, training operating companies and so on to make sure that their staff are armed. Most people, given that knowledge once, it's at low cost, but it's so important, well then you start to see that as part of customer service. They wouldn't have a bag of rubbish on the side of a train track or something because they know that that's not something that should be there. But because they are, the majority are non-disabled, they view the journey through their own eyes, as we all do, unless challenged to. So staff training and allowing people to train other people through day-to-day interaction about an accessible streetscape is really important, extremely simple. And also onus. If I we were talking about people's journeys earlier. One of our staff members were in Brixton, took 3 hours to get from Hillingdon because the staff at the stations didn't know where the ramp key was, didn't know how to use the ramp, they put her on the wrong train. So I might be able to get there, but really we have to think about these things. And the staff members are, they're absolutely integral. And our feedback is that the majority of them want to know, they just don't know. Yeah. And if they knew, they would do it. And so we don't hold those individuals accountable. We hold the system through which they are trained, managed, appraised, and they're held accountable for that. So that's our feedback, I think, for my feedback in terms of that we can spill it out from the stations into the streets.
No, great.
There's a couple of quick points I would make. One is that the larger the number of people involved in these conversations, the slower the decisions are, which is fairly obvious, but particularly looking at the western end of Crossrail, the developments around the stations there that have involved perhaps 2 operators, TfL, Network Rail, a council, it's just painfully slow, and working out who to talk to get decisions made is a nightmare. Everybody's standing around pointing at everybody else. The other thing that I would say is, whilst works are going on, and I'm sure the members will have seen this at London Bridge, the routes change as the works go on. So as routes change, people's planning. So fairly obviously, if you can't see where you're going, then you have to know the route changes, that's an issue. But the woman we saw on the video earlier, she will plan her route based on quiet places, based on places that she knows. When that changes, then it can really disrupt your journey.
Yep.
So it's about signage and thoughtfulness and having staff.
I've seen some really good examples of good practice from Transport for London recently around, for instance, Highbury Corner, which is near where I live, where they really worked hard to make sure that they kept things safe for people on foot or in wheelchairs or mobility scooters and on bikes throughout the roadworks, while the whole road system was changing, every passing week. So they were physically making sure that it was safe and that it was convenient and that there was level access. And they even trialled new ramps and things on the project. But I'm not sure that there was much in the way of information to people who might have been planning their journeys. So I wonder if that's something that TfL could take away to build on that very good practice that you are getting around temporary roadworks, to make sure that there is information on TfL's website so that people with mobility impairments or other disabilities are able to plan around those quite dynamic changes that can change from week to week at particular locations, particularly somewhere, you're obviously not going to be able to do it everywhere in London where there are roadworks, but somewhere like Highbury Corner, which is a massive interchange hub between bus and tube and bus and the overground. So there's a lot of people accessing it. Somewhere like that, it seems that might be helpful.
Yeah, I would be very happy to take that away. I'm sure, as you are aware, we regularly review customer feedback, and we have something we talk about often, which are customer pain points. What are the things that are really causing distress to our customers? And access to near and real-time information is absolutely critical. And if you have any additional needs, then that makes life even more difficult for you. So very, very happy to take that away.
Great, thank you. Just to welcome students from the London School of Economics. We are the Transport Committee this morning. We're looking at inclusive and accessible transport across London and how we make sure that the transport system caters for people with visible and invisible disabilities. So welcome. Just moving on swiftly to section 3, and if members and our guests just mindful of time in terms of your questions and response, that would be helpful. Thank you. Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. As Alan has already alluded in his earlier comments, only 33% of London stations will be step-free by spring next year. The question is, has the pace of change for step-free access across London Transport's network been too slow? Kirsty, you may want to start.
I'm actually going to defer to Alan because Alan was much more closely aligned with the inclusive transport strategy on this one, so I'm going to defer to Alan.
Keeping my answer brief, yes, it has. I appreciate that we are subject to a Victorian infrastructure and that these changes are not cheap to make, but we need to make them faster.
A response from other.
I mean, I think we can appreciate the frustration, but it is just incredibly difficult, and it's very old infrastructure. There are lots of logistical problems with it. We have now just delivered our 78th step-free station. We've invested 18 million. It will be a third of the network. But it's not just the underground networks. We've got more than 200 accessible stations, so it's a third of the underground, but there's a broader kind of step-free network than that. So we have more coming on stream, and as I said, what we're going to try and do with our future investment is try and make sure that we're really kind of getting the most bang for buck out of the stations that we're able to do. So making sure that they are where people need them, and they're kind of opening up the network as best they can. But given the challenges that we have, we are going as quickly as we can. We have funding constraints, as you know, which means that we're not able to do a lot of things, including accessibility, as quickly as as fast as we might like to. But we are making significant progress.
One thing I would add is that I went to speak to TfL and asked that what I would really like to be able to see, and I think our members and the people we support would like to be able to see, is, again, the criteria on which those decisions are predicated. So what is the cost value benefit, and where does access sit within that? And that's something that, I know that there is a process, in terms of your rating, and I think that we'd like to understand and see where disabled people's access sits within that rating. And I don't know if that's a process that can be made public, but I think it would be important to understand, the weighting upon which accessibility is given in terms of decisions that are made for where you spend your money.
Yeah. More widely than step-free.
Yeah, more widely than step-free. But I guess, if you're choosing to develop one and not the other, or you're delaying one, or you're, why, and what weighting does disabled people's needs have on that decision, or is it actually the amount of people who come through that station is more important than the needs that people have, and we don't know where the weighting of access sits in terms of your decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we're trying to address with that next.
Yeah, which is great to see because, again, we can then get behind decisions and understand delays rather than just feel that we're being left out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for stations on the Border Rail network, we've delivered kind of 354 stations with step-free access from the Access for All funding over the past kind of 3 control periods of funding, so 10 to 15 years. Is it enough, and is it quick enough until we have complete access? The answer is always going to be no. We're doing the best, the best that we can to make as many stations accessible as we can, given the kind of funding constraints, the infrastructure difficulties that we face in the design and delivery of these stations, and it's a process. We've done a lot, and we aspire to do more. There is £300 million as part of the DfT Inclusive Transport Strategy for Access for All across the network in this control period, and we will keep kind of rolling out that Access for All programme to deliver more stations that are accessible. I think the Access for All criteria to be included on that, we advise DfT. Applications are made by local delivery groups, which include ourselves, train operating companies, devolved governments, local regional transport bodies, etc. But the criteria around footfall, if there's a particular high instance of disability in the area, local circumstances, if there's a hospital nearby, to fill in gaps, if there's a particularly large gap between stations that are accessible. But there also needs to be a good geographic spread, so we're not focusing all the investment in one area, and we like to be able to kind of leverage other funding as well if there's other schemes going on to try and get the best improvements we can for the amount of money that there is to spend. And then that business case work is done, including those criterions held by DfT. So we advise them, and then we have the list to deliver. But I would say we've done a lot. There is still a lot more to do.
To be fair to TfL and the operators, they are subject to financial constraints, and the Access for All funding for the last 2 control periods was cut. So it can feel, as disabled people, that we are being shortchanged. And I think one of our issues is frustration at not understanding why these decisions get made. And if we can know that, then we'll have much more appreciation and be much more willing to work with the various bodies to deliver what they're trying to deliver.
There's concrete evidence and indeed appreciation that the progress is very, very slow in terms of developing step-free facilities. Question is, how can this be strategically expedited? Obviously, the Mayor's 200 million step-free program has come to an end, pretty much. There is the kind of initiative and programs which involve third-party funding, which again is a good thing. But I believe TfL, the Mayor, need to do more and can be do more to prioritize and expedite. For example, working with boroughs more strategically, because you got other funding potentials like the community infrastructure levy, section 106 and so on. Is there an informed move strategically from TfL to do this, to speed up the program, which is indeed very slow and causing enormous problems?
So the Mayor's committed to the programme which we have in place, so we'll have another 15 stations by spring of next year.
Yes.
But we are also always, when we're working with developers, looking at leveraging that third-party funding to make additional gains where we can. So that's absolutely part of what we do kind of day to day. In terms of the programme, we have the 15 by spring 2020, and then we've got a further 6 coming on by 23-24. So we have got that programme, committed to it, and making sure that that's working as hard as we can to make sure that that happens. But also always working with third parties to try and leverage extra funding and make those additional improvements where we can.
Thank you. Moving on, I have questions specific to both TfL and Network Rail. How do TfL and Network Rail strategically decide where to make accessible improvements in order to maximize impact? And also moving from there, does TfL look at how step-free interventions will improve the average step-free journey time, something which is there in MTS, I think, proposal 55. So if I can have comments, please.
Sure. So as I've said, so we're trying to take this new different approach, or I keep repeating myself about the new approach to step-free access, but working much more closely with lift users to try and understand where they would find the most value. So is it that we should try and plug gaps? Is that the best thing we should do? Or is it actually more useful to have more accessible hubs? Is it better for us? Are there key stations that we should be doing, even if they're more complex and more expensive, and have fewer of the more complex ones done to unlock parts of the network? Or is it better to try and do more and get a geographic spread? So rather than us coming up with our own list of criteria, what we want to do is speak to lift users about what would actually make the biggest difference to them and the journeys that they make. So that's how we're going to kind of be strategic about what the future programme should look like. And hopefully that will obviously have feed through on the impact to step-free, the comparative journey times of the step-free journey. But I think what's also really important that we are trying to recognise is that the journey time differential isn't necessarily the most important measure, and we're trying to make sure actually that when we're measuring the ease of making a journey, that we're using the right measure, and that journey time differential is part of it, but may not be the whole story. So we're also trying to work with people to understand what the measures for that, what are the measures for success? Is it just the differential, or does it go more widely than that, and identify what they should be?
I think Alan gave you an example earlier, having to bring your own equipment and also be grateful all the time in a way that I'm not. I jump in a tube, I don't have to talk to anyone, I don't have to put a smile on my face if I don't want to. I don't have to feel that my demeanour will have an impact on whether or not I can get on a train. And that's one of the biggest issues I think that we face in terms of, you're right, not necessarily journey time, but in the actions that I have to take in order to get access and parity to the same system that everybody else does.
So I can't remember the last time I took a journey where I didn't end up saying thank you to a staff member for whatever reason. And the other thing I would say in connection to these step-free works is it's all very well putting the works in, but they've then got to be usable. I mentioned the Waterloo and City line earlier, but it's really regular that lifts are out of order because there aren't staff available on the stations, both on the TfL network and the National Rail network. And there's nothing so frustrating as having a step-free station that you can't use.
Helen, do you want to?
So strategically how we make decisions on where to invest. So we have the Access for All programme, and I just ran through the criteria against which applications are assessed, and then DFT specify the stations for which we are going to do the works, which is about footfall, high incidence of disability, local circumstances, geographic spread, etc. And there is an additional fund available that's having applications to DFT at the moment of up to £1 million per project for broader accessibility works at stations, so not the access for all, but where there can be kind of partnerships with other funding to deliver more broadly things within stations that will make journeys easier. And the application process for that closes in November. But aside from that, we have our diversity impact assessments that we carry out at the early stages of projects and programmes, but also during the production of policies. And that's one way in which we are able to demonstrate that we're meeting our public sector equality duty, so that the needs of all users are thought about at those very early stages. We do also have our inclusive design strategy, which is all about looking at the projects that we're doing through the eyes of the people who are going to use them, and what are the needs of the people, all people who are going to use them. One area that we need to improve on, and that we are going to improve on, is really embedding that into people's thinking and making that more a compulsory part of the project development process as we go through the stages of project development. So we are looking at the moment to embed within our project and programme development process that it is mandatory to go to the Built Environment Accessibility Panel to have them review any works we're doing at stations, to check that we essentially mark our homework to check that we are putting in place the right things to enable people to use the railway more successfully.
One of the issues which I just want to comment on this, Chair, and I'm done after that. One of the issue which also I believe needs to be looked at is talking about step-free or access or generally access. When you have wheelchair users, for example, at platforms, manual ramps. I know that in the earlier period after London Olympics, there were horrendous problems of compliance with those manual ramps to provide access from platform to the trains. I believe that situation has improved, but there still are still serious problems I certainly have come across through casework of people either not getting access to the staff to have those facilities available, or they just can't find the ramps at times as well, where when they find the staff themselves. So something which again is part and parcel of the access in terms of a proper journey.
You raise a really important issue. We've invested significantly in the training, in particular of underground customer service staff, to understand the differing needs of people who have a disability. So we've had so far upwards of 1,000 people who've attended that training. One of the things that has come out, though, when we audit and we check to see whether we can be trained once, but that information needs to stick. You need to access it when you need to, and where people have not been able to locate a ramp, say on the station, or there are rosters and routes where people are working in different stations. What we've done in response to that is to make sure there are kind of accessibility leads. To be able to give people coming onto the shift just the basic kind of FAQs as to where ramps are and other things that are particular to that station. So it's something we take incredibly seriously, hence the reason why we invested in the training and taking the approach that we have. But you make a very good point.
Great. Do you mind if I just briefly comment? Yeah. So ramps are really useful. On the whole, the turn up and go service that TfL offer is really well appreciated. And on the Network Rail and the National Rail Network, ramps are an issue. People are very regularly left on trains or can't get on trains. People are expected to turn up half an hour before a train in order to get on it. So that can really lengthen your journey if the journey is just a 30-minute journey. The other thing I would say is the underground network that has level access, being able to get on and off a train without needing assistance is a revelation to all sorts of people. And Greater Anglia have just introduced low-floor trains. So by doing so, 40% of their network now doesn't need ramps. So one thing that I'd like to encourage the train operators, but also TfL, is to investigate low-floor trains to get rid of that need.
We're going to come on to that very point.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, it's fine. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Yeah, I want to pick up a couple of issues. Actually, I would just say when you're planning, Christina, I had a constituent has messaged us, I've been here, saying that Waltham Forest Borough has no step-free stations at all. So in terms of planning, maybe they're quite complex, I don't know. But actually, if there's a huge hole in the network, that might be the sort of thing you need to be looking at. What I wanted to pick up is in our Crossrail report, and Alan already mentioned earlier, the issue of the stations, particularly out to the west. But we recommended that when you look at future infrastructure projects, looking at the work such as step-free access, could you bring them forward in the process? Could they be installed potentially even at the start so that all those people using the station can benefit from that as early as possible in the process? rather than just having to suffer so much when the works are going on and then suddenly it's unveiled at the end, or there's not enough money for them and they risk slipping or even being cancelled. Is that something that TfL are going to be doing in Network Rail to make sure we can get that infrastructure in as early as possible?
I can start on Crossrail specifically, and in the delivery of the Network Rail elements of the Elizabeth line, we programmed the work in order to deliver the core infrastructure to enable the train service to run kind of as soon and as effectively as we could, and that meant that the accessibility of the stations was put into that second package to come along and do afterwards. 14 of the stations are now accessible, 6 are partially accessible, and the final 10 should be by the end of 2020. But that decision was made in order to expedite the delivery of the bits of infrastructure that were required to run the train service. I think moving forwards, things that, and I'm in danger of repeating myself again, but the things like the inclusive design principles where we look at the very beginning, at the very specification of a project about what does the infrastructure needs to have, what do we need to do to the infrastructure to make sure that it is accessible for all people, and really building and specifying it in at the beginning with the advice and guidance of the Built Environment Accessibility Panel. But it's when you have it in there at the start, it's then intrinsically woven through that project. It can't just be dragged and dropped out or moved to a later stage of delivery. And it's more efficient and cost effective to deliver as you're developing the programme as well, as if it's an integral part. And that's very much where we want to move to. Where we did with London Bridge, I think that's an example of where that worked very successfully in terms of what the environment, I understand there was construction difficulties and moving around the station whilst it was being built. But in terms of the finished product, there are a lot of very good things about that station now, and that's because it was thought about at the very start when it was being designed. And if we can introduce that into more of our programmes of work, I think we will then start giving a better service to people who face barriers to transport.
But it's also when you're thinking about these projects going forward, will you look to see whether the step 3 element could be delivered earlier in the project and opened earlier?
I think we would consider that as part of the overall delivery staging of the works, to do it in the least disruptive, most cost-effective manner, because for we need to consider any project individually and the trade-offs between the cost and the deliverability and constructability issues. So yes, we would look to see whether the accessibility elements could be delivered earlier. Does that make sense? Is it doable? Or would that cause an acceptable level of disruption?
But it is something you will actively consider now, whether those sort of elements could be brought forward or opened earlier. Yeah,
the staging of projects, absolutely. The delivery of projects, accessibility as part of that, yes.
Yeah, and TfL?
I think what I just to add is I will not want to get into trouble with our engineering colleagues, because the complexity of infrastructure builds and the phasing and the phasing of projects, and then what that then impacts upon when we look at what we're building across the entire network is something that is hugely complex. So if I may, I will come back to you with a
but just on that, because obviously everyone did mention, and going back to the beginning, an inclusive and accessible transport system is something that if we have those improvements, it will benefit everybody. So
for some of the lifts have opened already. So in some of the stations, we've got lifts that are already operating to platforms, even though the trains aren't there. But I think, going back to, Crossrail's been a long and complex project, but I think we've all learned a lot from this. And for example, thinking about Crossrail 2 and how we would design this kind of the accessibility, but also the phasing of how quickly you can make some of those improvements will definitely inform future schemes.
And to benefit everybody.
Yeah.
And also I think we need to add in this human level, we're talking about phasing projects, but I think you need to question yourselves of who are you willing to leave out, and I mean that because your organisations are made up of individuals as we are, and I think really that should be at the heart of what you do. Who are you willing to leave out? And I don't think in good conscience anything should be built or considered in 2019 that isn't as fully accessible as is possible given constraints of the physical that maybe, you know, and that's our ask really. You know, and our challenge, who are you willing to leave out? Thank you.
And then Alan's already touched on the accessible rolling stock. The government has set out that by 2020 all passenger trains have to meet modern accessibility standards, and they've set out what those are. And we'd already heard about Greater Anglia introducing rolling stock with lower level floors and a retractable step at each door, helping to bridge the gap. Could innovations like that retractable step be introduced more widely across the rail network, and are there plans? I realise we don't have Rail Delivery Group here who might be able to answer some of that, but TfL, have you got plans for this sort of innovation?
I will write to you after the committee. I think we, as part of the Action Inclusion strategy and the development of the inclusive design framework, need to make sure that we have the right rolling stock that meets the changing needs of Londoners. So it would be actively, of course, considered, but we will need to conduct a wider review to determine, you know, what's already in train, and then what we will do when budgets allow for the purchase of new rolling stock.
But for the Elizabeth line, that's like a new generation of trains. So the class 3, 4, 5s, and this is straying into an area of technical expertise, which I don't necessarily have. But those, you know, where we have commissioned those, we've procured new trains. They are designed to be accessible. There's, you know, that they have the latest technology to make sure that they will serve as wide a range of customers as is possible. And then there's obviously, in terms of renewal of ongoing rolling stock, that's a more complex question. But again, I think it's that, as you said, in this kind of, as we move forward, there's no reason why we wouldn't always be looking to those most innovative and accessible procurement decisions where we can.
Right, Helen?
Rolling stock specification is not Network Rail's kind of within our purview. I think I would just recognise that ideally there would be step-free access from trains to platforms, and it's incredibly difficult with both the age of the infrastructure that we have, some of the bends that some of our stations, especially outside London, are designed around, and the variety of rolling stock that's on the network. So what would be step-free for one train would not necessarily be step-free from another train, but very much up to the franchise specifier and the kind of the bidders to address that.
Yeah. Maybe that's something we'll pick up with RDG Group.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are examples around the world. I've heard of Spain, I'm told, is very good. They've got some real innovations on their trains, and if we've got this one already, Greater Anglia, you know, we should be looking at that. And you know, as Alan and others were saying earlier, I met a campaigner the other week who was saying how liberating it was getting onto the Thames Link, because they literally, in the core, straight on, they didn't have to have any help. And I witnessed that myself last night, and I thought, actually, this is changing, but clearly our infrastructure, it's not all going to be level floor, so what can we do? And if this sort of retractable step is a possibility, then maybe it's something TfL and the train companies need to be looking at.
I think for us it's a case of aspiration. You know, this rolling stock lasts 40 years, so the decisions that we make now are going to have long-term impacts. So I think it's Holland that said that in 10 years they'll make their infrastructure step-free. We don't have any kind of aspiration like that. And as we're buying the new underground trains, now's the time.
No, definitely. Thank you. Assembly Member Curtin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to ask all of you actually about what you think about buses and bus accessibility. You know, what progress has been made so far on improving bus accessibility, and do you think anything more needs to be done? So anyone like to start off with that?
Kick off. We think we've got the largest accessible bus network anywhere in the world. So 95% of London's bus stops are accessible, and we have a fleet of almost 10,000 buses that are all low floor and can kneel and provide spaces for both buggies as well as wheelchairs. You'll of course hear on the buses as well announcements, and you'll see visual displays for people who may have a sensory impairment, or even if you're just a visitor coming to London and want to know whether to get off at the next stop. So I think over the last 10 years we've made quite significant improvements in bus accessibility and the design of buses. As I touched on earlier, we have trained our bus drivers as well in terms of and how best to support customers. We've trained bus drivers to be able to manage some of the tensions in who should use that space, which is currently allocated for, and the priority should be wheelchair users, but sometimes people who have a pram are wanting to occupy that space. So bus drivers have learnt to broker and make decisions almost on behalf of customers, so that wheelchair users are always given priority. So I think we've made good progress when it comes to improving the accessibility of the bus network. And I should also add that, as I'm sure the committee will know, most trips by people who have a mobility impairment are made by buses. So we're less limited by the old infrastructure that we have on the underground, and so I think we've done what we can on the buses, because we've updated the kind of rolling stock now and our vehicles.
I think we understand and accept that, but I think the anecdotal evidence from a vast majority of people that use buses and our members across London is that in reality the application of things that are in the big red book, both for those who work under the TfL service and the other licences that are given by TfL, is that drivers quite often don't know the rules. They don't understand that they mustn't stop if there's someone at the bus stop. So if a visually impaired person is there, they don't necessarily know the bus is coming. Buses don't always stop for them, which is one of the things that they're supposed to do. They don't really understand how to make the bus kneel or where they have to kneel in terms of being on the side of the road. They will often leave a disabled person to languish and to themselves express their own needs to 20 people squashed into the wheelchair space. And when our members are asking for support, there's quite often a challenge with the bus driver. We're not going to make a comment on as to why that is, but sometimes it's just people not doing a very good job, as in any part of the country. But we don't believe that there is really enough of an impetus on bus drivers to do a good job in terms of disabled people. It's an add-on, it's an addition. That's the way that most of our members feel. And again, my concern is that there's a high level of gratitude from disabled people when they have a good opportunity, something good happens, example, a good experience, sorry, is the word I'm looking for. I'm not grateful when I have a good experience. It's my expectation. And that's where we need to get to. So our members feel that they're not being catered for in the way that they should be. And when they are, it's rarer than it should be.
Yeah. The TfL, do you want to respond to that?
I think that variability is concerning and is unacceptable, where people have a poor experience on buses. And of course, some people from time to time won't respond in the way they ought to make sure that someone's journey is a good one on the bus network. But we have really invested in the training of bus drivers to improve the customer experience. Also, we know that when it comes to looking at slip, trips and falls on buses, you're more likely to have a slip, trip and fall if you are a more vulnerable bus user, or you're an older bus user as well. So we have worked with all of our contracted bus providers. There are regular accessibility focused sessions at the bus depots, and it's something that we constantly try to improve kind of month on month. And we have a lead in the bus team who is responsible for this. We've
Just,
also,
I'm going to pick up that point, Cindy, because we run a lot of those sessions in the bus garages. A lot of our members do individually. And again, as we alluded to at the beginning, yes, it's great that we're having that one-to-one lived experience conversation, but we're not paid for it. It quite often happens when there's been a problem and everyone goes, panics, oh, quick, come in and talk to us then. It's not something that is part of a planning, of a procedure, in the way that you would teach somebody about health and safety, you teach them how to turn the bus on. I don't believe, and I can evidence this through looking at the process of the training and the management of bus drivers, that access is seen as an integral part of what you do. It isn't yet. It is starting to be, but our experience is that that process is still often reactive to a problem happening. That's my feedback, Staynton.
We still have examples of bus garages where the idea of accessibility training is to put somebody in a wheelchair. To put a bus driver in a wheelchair and pretend that that's the lived experience, or to put on a blindfold and pretend that that's the lived experience. It's less common than it was, but the fact that it still happens at all is just shocking. The other thing I would say is that a bus is 65 seats or whatever it is, but it's one seat for me. So if there's a wheelchair or a walker or a buggy, that's it. I don't get on. So that's particularly bad during periods of disruption or during rush hour. Now, this isn't I can squeeze onto a bus, it's I don't travel.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a disconnect between what you're saying and what you're saying. So, I mean, how are you going to take those comments on?
No, I think what you're saying is happening is correct. I just think it's not happening in a way so I don't think what you're saying is wrong, Staynton. It is happening, but it's not happening in a way that is absolutely integral. It's often reactive to an issue. It's asking disabled people to come in and do the jobs of the organisation for free. That's my opinion. And it's not done in a way whereby if the bus drivers then don't enact the things they've been told, there are consequences. You know, I know there are issues at TfL, and we do work with your team, and that actually sometimes there are consequences, but you can't tell us, and then we can't tell our members, which is slightly frustrating. So no, I don't think we're speaking from different places. I just think the reality is slightly different than it might look as a project on the ground.
I mean, I've got to be fair. There are commendations. Disabled people do identify the bus drivers that are particularly good, particularly proactive, that defuse situations. So we do have some stunning bus drivers, but at the other end of the scale, we also have some dreadful ones.
Right. So there's very good practice, but not everyone is up to the best standards. So I'm sure that we'll be trying to make the training, make sure everyone gets to those good standards. But look, just moving on a little bit. I mean, that's bus accessibility. But what about bus stops? I mean, you mentioned earlier, obviously, real-time information is very important, and we saw that on the video that we had. But are there any other small changes that could be made to infrastructure at bus stops and also stations as well, and that could improve people's experiences of using them? What does anyone think about that? Any other things that we haven't mentioned already?
There's a couple of points that I'd make. One is about this accessibility standard. So it's all very well having the standard, but sometimes you get street lights, rubbish bins, just advertising poles. They're positioned badly, so it's very hard for the driver to stop in a place where both the front and the back doors are accessible. So I'm not sure that those standards have been thought about. The other thing to think about is there are still, across London, pockets of hail and ride where there are no bus stops. There is no timetable. The bus can't get to the curb. How do I get on and off? We need to eliminate those existing routes.
Yeah, thanks. What might be the impediments to bringing in those changes? I mean, are they maybe TfL can answer them? They seem to be quite simple changes to make. Are there things that you're thinking about, or are there things that are preventing those changes from being made?
I think it goes back to the previous point in many ways. So we have 95% of accessible bus stops. We have a fully accessible bus service. So in a way, on paper, you know, we've done it. We're there, really. But that doesn't mean that that's the lived experience. And I think what's really important for us is to keep that dialogue with stakeholders so we can understand where it's going wrong and try and pick up those problems where we find them. Because the kind of the network-wide approach, I think, is there, but that doesn't mean that those pockets don't exist or that, you know, examples of bad experience don't exist that we can deal with as we come across them. So I think that's a big part of our kind of ongoing engagement with people, to understand the lived experience of what it's like on the network. And I think signage, communication, real-time information, again, is just really key to those kind of small interactions that mean that you know what you're up against before you get there. So that's a kind of, I think that's an ongoing journey for us to make sure that things work as smoothly as we want them to.
I mean, we have to be quite relentless. And we don't take our foot off the pedal because being a bus driver is an incredibly challenging role. It's an incredibly dynamic environment, and at times it's incredibly stressful too. So we bring back customer insights, customer feedback, speak to the operators, provide different types of training. We're about to go out to tender to provide very focused disability equals training for our bus drivers, because where we've got pockets of good practice, that's great, but there are, up to almost 20,000, I think, bus drivers who work across the network. So we have to be pretty relentless, and I would say that we are, just to complement the buses that are fully accessible. So we take it very seriously.
But one final thing, if I may. I'm a fairly savvy transport user. Our members are fairly savvy. They know that they can come to us, they can go to TfL. I think the issue that you've got is the people that aren't savvy. How do they know how to report their experience? How do you identify the person that doesn't use the bus because they are scared, unknowledgeable? I don't know how you do reach out to them, but there's a definite need to identify those people, get them using the networks.
Thanks.
Just very quickly, one of the things we identified through the consultation that we did through the Railway for Everyone is one of the key barriers to people using the railway, so not buses in this instance, but the railway, is a lack of awareness of what the processes are and what the assistance is that's available. So one of the key things that we do need to improve on across the transport sector is making people aware of what the assistance is, how do they book assistance, what do they do if things go wrong, who do they talk to, what's available. I think in terms of communication of information and what information could we provide on buses, again, communication of information is one of the key things and one of the key barriers that people we talk to saw for using the railway and using transport. And I think aspirationally, one of the things that would be really good for us to start looking at is how do you provide information on one form of transport about the next mode of transport. So if you're on a bus, do you know where your train's going from and if it's going to be on time? And if you're getting off a train at a London terminal, do you know if the underground's running smoothly or if there's significant roadworks or disruption outside the station? And I think that's, well, we shouldn't stop trying to get to kind of existing standards and levels of information provision. I think we also need to keep on looking at what the next step is as well.
And just to build on that, not to think that we have all of the answers ourselves within our organisation too. So the work that has been done to open source data, to get third-party developers to make better use of the information, to then be able to provide kind of wayfinding, near-time updates. That's incredibly important in our view around in the accessibility space, because there are lots of innovations both in the UK and also in other parts of the world that might significantly help to improve people being able to make a planned journey. So we'll continue to pull out the information and update our website and the TfL Go app, but we also need to, through our innovation team, work very closely to spark off, I would say, those innovation challenges, to have third-party developers come and help us make our customers' experiences a lot better.
Okay. Thanks. I'll just finally move on to talk about and ask you about taxis, because of course all taxis in London are wheelchair accessible. What about taxi ranks, and what progress has been made on improving the accessibility of taxi ranks? Maybe TfL can answer that again.
Yeah, so there are no national criteria for what constitutes an accessible taxi rank, which is part of what's difficult. And I think the value of taxis and them being fully accessible is that they offer the curb-to-curb service, which obviously means that you don't know necessarily where they're going to stop. So I think what's really important is the vehicles are accessible, they have the ramp, the drivers are fully trained. So we should be able to offer that accessible service to anybody who's using them, but that doesn't necessarily constitute a kind of accessible rank, if you like.
Yeah,
so taxis are not 100% accessible.
No,
well, I'm talking about the black taxis.
Yeah, they're not.
They're not, but all wheelchair.
I can't use a black taxi. I'm too tall, and a lot of the people that I know are also too tall. So whilst they are the most accessible form of taxi, they're not 100% accessible.
Does that include the new taxi? The new
It does, yes.
That's interesting.
The new ones are better than the old ones, but they're still not perfect.
Okay, but is that, I mean, that's for you specifically because of your using too tall? Okay.
But I know a lot of people, you know, as a population, we are growing in stature. So that problem is increasing, not decreasing.
Okay.
One thing I would say about stopping black taxis on the street, one of the consequences of cycle lanes is wheelchairs getting from the pavement across the cycle lane to the taxi. Or indeed, if it's a single lane road, the taxi stops to load the wheelchair user and it blocks the road. So there are unintended consequences that we need to consider.
And something being physically accessible doesn't make it accessible necessarily, because there may be attitudinal barriers. They might not want to pick up a wheelchair user because it takes ages in their opinion. It doesn't, by the way, including on buses. There is some research on that it increases waiting times. You might not know how to clip somebody in. So although something has been built to be accessible, it's a bit like not, if you don't know how to use it, they're not going to use it. So actually, again, the lived experience is that they're not. Some people literally can't fit in them, and other people are not given access to them because the person inside that vehicle doesn't necessarily want to let them in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most of the time taxi drivers do a very, very good job and are very aware of these things. But,
yeah, we do, and our experience is the same. And we work with private hire vehicle companies, and we've been in contact with the black cabs. That's true, but the point I make, David, is that tagline, 100% accessible, isn't true, and it's more complex than it appears to be, and it's something that we have to challenge every day.
Okay, right.
And I think that's fair. So they're wheelchair accessible, but they don't take all types of wheelchair. They take most, but not all. So I think we acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, every cab can take a wheelchair, but not every kind of wheelchair.
Yeah, and all drivers are trained, so they should all know how to do that. But again, acknowledge that there will be times when that's not perfect, and we would urge you to contact us and let us know when that happens so that we can look into it.
I mean, one of the things that taxi drivers are concerned about is not being able to have access to all the roads in London as sort of changes come in. You mentioned cycles, superhighways, and there's the sort of situation in Tottenham Court Road where the road's being narrowed and they're not going to have 24/7 access as they had before. I mean, that is a big problem. Are you planning to change that in any way so that taxis can continue to have the maximum access to all roads in London? That's really necessary for wheelchair users that use taxis.
Yes, I think the Mayor's transport strategy, to implement the Mayor's transport strategy and to achieve our objectives, there will be changes to the road layout in London. That is going to happen. I think what's really important and what we do is engage with stakeholders when we're doing it, particularly with disability groups, to understand what those access needs are. And then through engagement and identifying through quality impact assessments what the impacts are, we can identify mitigations. And then through consultation, for example, on Tooley Street, then you do listen and adjust as that needs to happen.
No, I do understand with Tooley Street. I mean, that's something that I asked the Mayor about a lot, and he's continued to allow taxis to use Tooley Street, which is great. But That didn't happen with Tottenham Court Road, for example. The opposites happened there. So that's a problem. So, I mean, it's just, it doesn't always
I think that
happen
was a decision with the borough as well. So that was Tottenham Court Road was Camden.
Yeah, it was, but that's also, you know, it's supported by the Mayor's transport strategy as well. So, I mean, it's just something that's, you know, needs to be thought about, I think. Anyway, okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry.
I just add a little extra. I mean, so black taxis are vital for disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
Disabled people, it costs around £500 a month more to live as a disabled person. So if you're using black taxis and the taxi can't take the direct A to B route, they've got to route round some ULEZ zone or some no-go area, that puts up the cost to the disabled person. But it may put them out of their taxi card allowance. So it cuts down on the journeys they can take. It has a serious impact.
Specifically on taxis, they're not included in the ultra-low emission zone or the congestion charge. They wouldn't have to route around those to avoid a charge.
So I was thinking particularly of the closures in the city that they have to route round.
Yeah, I think road closure is just in terms of those schemes.
I'd just like to add just really quickly also, and people aren't always cited on this, but certainly in relation to private taxis, less so black cabs, where individuals don't pick somebody up who is in a wheelchair, they refuse to pick somebody up who is in a wheelchair, and they're able to, we will prosecute people because we take it incredibly seriously if people are trying to get around and they are being refused a service that they should be able to access. So this is something that we do often in response to concerns raised by disabled people who want to use a taxi. It's not always, we don't always talk about those prosecutions, but just to give a sense and a flavour of how seriously we take disabled customers' needs.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Just, I think, to put in writing to me, because we won't have time now, we haven't talked about the design of buses, and I hear a lot of concerns about the lack of wheelchair spaces, and also why don't we have fold-down seats in London? We do elsewhere in the country. I met some campaigners the other week, they talked about Reading buses being good, Brighton buses, I hear, the design's good, in Barcelona. There's also an issue around the button that you press. You don't have any acknowledgement whether the driver's got that you want to get off at the next stop. Is that something TfL's actively considering, redesigning buses? And could you put something in writing with the
I'll
plans?
put something to you in writing. We're actually considering that, but I'll put more detail in writing.
Moving on from buses, obviously one of the other things is around a number of buses are fitted with the cameras, and I'm hoping that newer buses as well, that camera technology is a lot more improved. Where we will be working with the relevant operators to monitor some of that practice and training that's not followed through. So a key one for a number of elderly passengers is the fact that bus drivers not waiting for them to sit down. All of that can be captured by the CCTV monitoring. And in terms, the other thing is around giving the drivers the confidence to maybe address some of those issues. So I had to challenge a woman in with her buggy because she point blank refused to move to let a wheelchair user come on, and you could see that the bus driver felt very uncomfortable challenging her, and everyone started filming. But I think it's about how we work with the different operators so that the bus drivers feel confident to challenge that. Thank you. Moving on swiftly, we've got two more sections, so if members, again, just mindful of time, we're looking at assisted transport services. Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you. I think I'll start with Kirsty here. What are the main challenges to accessing assisted transport services in London?
The disparity in an opportunity. For example, Turn Up and Go works extremely well for some people in certain areas, but that isn't something that works across the network. Mm-hmm. So in fact, somebody tweeted me this morning and said, please make sure you remember today that I have to choose where I live and work and socialise based on how good the turn up and go system is, because otherwise I'll be late for work, I won't be able to meet friends. So there is where it's good because of people, not because of the organisation, if I'm honest, and the systems, it's good, and where it isn't, it isn't. So there's no real parity of opportunity across the network. And also, in my opinion, one of the biggest issues is that when it fails, there doesn't seem to really be any issue with that. It's not the same as if a staff member swore at a member of the public, there would be problems there. That, you know, and it doesn't seem to happen when there's an access fail. It's just something that seems to be accepted. So that's one of the biggest things that we'd like to change around that. Alan, there's probably other things you want to add around that.
We're pressed for time. So.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
No,
so really, yeah.
Just on that, on the assisted one, we're looking at maybe the door-to-door services, if you feel that, and dial-a-ride, taxi cards, things like that, where you feel there maybe needs to be improvements.
They're ever changeable, these systems. At the moment, as Alan alluded to, one of our worries is if there is going to be changes around how public hire vehicles and black cabs are allowed to move across the city, and the charges, how will that impact on dial-a-ride? I don't have any particular issues around that one.
So I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago with somebody that had booked a dial-a-ride, and it took 3 different vehicles to arrive to find one that he could get into. So it's predictability, it's reliability, and it meant that he was sitting there for an hour waiting to leave the meeting, whereas anybody else would have been home on to their next meeting. And it's that predictability, that reliability, and also being able to specify your needs. So obviously different people have different preferences, and those aren't listened to often enough.
To TfL, I suppose the question is, are you looking at this very uneven service? What would be your take on addressing this? Because it seems to be the major challenge.
Yeah, we have a very robust service improvement plan. We've received the most number of complaints with regard to the taxi service and city fleet, and they are the company who manage dial-a-ride. So we have a very robust improvement plan, which that has begun to garner, I would say, improvements in the service. So very clear as to the window that Turn Up and Go should be attending to people's homes. I think people have sometimes missed appointments as a result of the buses not turning up at the time that was scheduled and planned, and these have been addressed through those discussions with the contracted service city fleet. So it's something we are on top of because the concerns raised by customers have shown that the service perhaps has not been of the standard that we would expect.
I want to move on because we're pressed for time and talk about personal budget, ATS personal budgets, which was a recommendation that came from a report by this committee. I understand a pilot was started, and what's the condition of that pilot? I do have a note here that tells me. And is there any plans to look at another pilot?
I don't have that recorded here, so what I'll have to say is that I'll respond to you.
If you could come back to the committee, that would be helpful.
Okay, let me just... how many people accessed TfL's travel monitoring service last year? Mentoring, sorry, move on to... Mentoring service.
Number of people, we don't have the absolute figures. I don't think we have the number. So again, I'll have to write back to you with the precise number.
As a committee, I'm sure we'd like to see those numbers, because the obvious question is, is it a lot of people? And if not, how could you promote it? Are people aware of this? Do you? Let me speak to Kirsty and Alan. Are your members very active on this service? Are they aware of it? Do you think it needs more visibility?
I don't think our members are users of the service because they're already users of transport networks.
Okay.
But the service itself is very highly respected. It's an excellent service with some excellent staff, does some really good work, and I would encourage TfL to promote it as widely as possible.
And I think a lot of our members have used it as a jumping off point, even if they haven't continued to. So I've got examples of people who've used it and now they don't need it, which is exactly what it's for. Well, not always, but sometimes so, yeah.
I think it's well used, but we can come back on the precise numbers.
Some figures would be very interesting, because if it's such a good service, let's hope it's not a secret. So would be the answer to that. Just one thing, it's about control and flexibility. Alan made a comment about people not being able to express their needs when they're using dial-a-ride, etc. Do you support the concept that people should have more control? And if so, how are you building it into your future changes to the system?
Absolutely. I think people should have as great a degree of agency and control as possible. One aspect that we're focusing on currently, but also will be brought into our action and inclusion strategy, is how we give people more information to be able to make decisions in their best interest, rather than decisions being made by other people. Access to information is hugely critical, whilst also making sure we're listening to people, not just listening but also responding and telling people how we've responded to some of the concerns that they have raised, which then is this will be reflected in the inclusive design framework that we've talked about already.
Some of Alan's comments suggested that users need to be able to give you more information so you can respond quickly and appropriately. Is that part of your thinking as well?
Yeah.
Okay. And at what point is a personal travel budget? Is that in your thinking? Some people are very up on that concept because it gives them control and they can plan. How is that in TfL's thinking about personal travel budgets?
To write to you more formally once the committee has finished, because in terms of the pilot you referenced earlier, we are not yet currently aware of progress made in terms of personalised travel budgets. So I'll write to you more formally.
Okay, we'd really appreciate that detail, I'm sure, Chair. Thank you.
Just on to our last session now.
Just maybe in this long letter you're going to be writing to us, could you just clarify, you said City Fleet manage dial-a-ride. They don't. They manage taxicard. You run dial-a-ride directly. I think you may have been muddling the service, unless I've missed that.
I might have muddled.
Perhaps we could just get some clarity on that, because I think we sort of muddled two very distinct services, and we have argued in the past maybe we need more common eligibility criteria and systems to use them better, but perhaps we can get some clarity on that. I'm just going to ask you, looking at information for passengers, how easy is it to currently plan an accessible transport journey, and what can be done, or what are you doing to improve that? And that's, not just whether the lift is operating at the station, but also which side the doors open when you get to a certain station, so you can position yourself so you're not having to have hundreds of passengers moving off to allow you to exit. TfL, what are you doing?
So we try to make as much of our information available as we can. So there are things that we're doing. So for example, for people with claustrophobia, we have maps of stations that are above ground. So we try and make the information available so that people can use what they need, but also that with the open data, it's where we're really calling on other people to help us make that available. And what we'd like to do is start moving to more personalised information. So for example, if you can do escalators but you can't do stairs, or if you can do 2 steps but you can't do 10 steps, how we can try and build that information into journey planning so that people can get kind of personalised travel advice according to their needs. So we are trying to take that forward, but we're also making that data available so that others can also help provide those services. But we recognise that really that kind of personalised information is what's going to make a really big difference, because otherwise there are so many layers of it. There's the claustrophobia map, and there's one about partially that it doesn't help you if you can't kind of marshal that information if we just keep pumping out more and more without some way of people being able to filter it for their needs.
How are you encouraging the sector to innovate in this way, to come up with the latest app, the latest information that could help people in this way? It sounds That sounds like a great idea, but what are you doing to facilitate that and encourage it?
So we're doing some of that ourselves internally in terms of what we can do with Journey Planner and other future iterations of TfL information. But also, as Staynton said, we do a lot of work in terms of kind of innovation hubs and trying to spark competitions and encourage other people to kind of apply themselves to the problems that we're facing.
So you've got a competition around this, have you?
Well, I don't know if there's a competition specifically on this, but there certainly have been in the past. I'll come back with more specific detail, but this is the kind of thing that we'll be looking at in the new strategy, the Action on Inclusion strategy, is how we can push that information. We've done good things so far, but we need to build on that now and make it more, as people increasingly use apps to plan their travel, we want to make sure that we're able to give them the information that they're looking for. So it's something that we'll continue to take forward, and we'll be working with industry, and I can check on the specifics of which competitions have been run on which things.
Okay, and Network Rail, what do you do?
In terms of communication, I think there's a number of strands to this. There is making sure that communication about the assistance available, which parts of the network are accessible, and when facilities that are important to people with disabilities are broken, and then when they're fixed, and keeping that live and up to date and robust so that it can be relied on, is something that across industry we're working very hard on with the Rail Delivery Group. In terms of our managed stations specifically, there's a page on our website for each of our managed stations that says what the facilities are there and what's available when it's broken, what the alternatives are. I think that's one strand. There is a much more of an awareness now that we need to cater for people with hidden disabilities. And so making information available in more formats and more accessible formats. Communication of information on the rail network in general to passengers, regardless of whether they are disabled or have barriers, is an area that we need to improve on. And Andrew Haynes is very focused on that as part of the Putting Passengers First programme and restructure. We have a network services part of our organisation now, and the executive director of that will shortly be appointing somebody to lead on passenger communications and really drive that forward, because it's an area that we recognise we need to improve to get more timely information, especially during times of disruption. And it's at times of disruption that people who face barriers to transport are more affected than anybody else. So if I don't know what's going on the rail network, I have a confidence that, I'm probably going to be okay. Whereas if information is poorly communicated to somebody who was already nervous about that journey, it could put somebody off from using that form of transport again for a very long time. And we know we need to get better there. The other area of communication and information is passenger assist for us, and the system by which people need to book to come and use the trains, which TfL have their turn up and go policy, and we are not at that yet as Network Rail at our managed stations. And although it's going to be challenging for us due to the age of the legacy systems that we use, we are absolutely committed to kind of hitting the accessible travel policy ORR guidelines of getting down to 2 hours notice by 2022. I think they're the areas for us for communications.
Okay. And will that work you're talking about around communications also include people who are digitally excluded? Because that is an area as well.
So I don't have the detail, and I don't know if the detail on that is formed yet, but it absolutely needs to. It can't just rely on technology, because there's a broad demographic that is not able or very unwilling to use that.
And cognitive ability as well,
yes.
I think is really important. That's, even they're describing the page to page, it's a maelstrom really of so I think the cognitive abilities of people to access it is really important. We're doing it ourselves. Our members are doing it ourselves.
Yes.
They the step free map, often doesn't show you can't cross a platform, so it might show step free, but that doesn't mean that actually you can travel around on it. So members of ours are building their own, if I'm honest, and they talk to one another and they share. So the way that they actually plan their journeys is through talking to each other using social media and using our platforms. And we're starting to do our own because we're getting a bit frustrated about the lack of support from providers. I think the idea of something competitive would be great, but I don't think it's happened. No. And again, we are doing it ourselves.
Yeah. Alan, have you got anything to add about planning an accessible transport journey, the communications?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Information is key.
Yeah.
Both in planning and during disruption.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Kirsty's mentioned the Step 3 tube map, which is mostly accurate. Helen mentioned the Network Rail website. Again, the station information is out of date. It's worse to have incorrect information than no information. And as Kirsty said, a lot of our members are working on it themselves. But yesterday, so there was a meeting at Parliament with the Extinction Rebellion protests that are going on. People didn't get information about disruption from TfL or from Network Rail. They got it from each other. So there were conversations going on yesterday morning, sharing routing information, because that's the most accurate. And it's a really hard problem. I've got a lot of sympathy, but it is one that needs solving. It's all very well saying we're going to make data available and let people work on solutions. But people, commercial people, want that easy 90%, the commercial 90%. As disabled people, we're in that 10% that doesn't get catered for. That's got to be led by TfL, Network Rail and the TOCs. The other thing is that the information is inconsistent between companies. So you would think that the rail companies all have the same policies about turn up and go, about assistance, about how you get assistance. Do you go to the platform? Do you go to the ticket office? Is it the guard that gets you off the train? Platform staff? It's entirely inconsistent, and that's a problem.
That's a problem as well. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Just to thank our guests, I think obviously this is a big issue, and as we go deeper we can uncover many things that is working well, but a lot of areas where we need more joined up thinking and a lot more funding and a lot more thinking about the end users and the people who are using the service. Just to thank everybody. Can we note the report and the discussions, please, members? Just two more items on our agenda, then everyone can go. Can we note the work programme? And the date of our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday the 12th of November here in the Chamber. Are there any other urgent businesses? No? Thank you very much.
GLA, Chamber, Sound.